City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for June 3rd, 2019. Thank you all for joining us in the audience and on the television. We will start our meeting tonight, as we start most of our meetings, with citizen comment on agenda items. I have a sign-up sheet here that we will start with, and when I call your name, if you would come to the podium and adjust the microphone so that we can hear you clearly. Give us your first name and your last name and your address, and tell us, if you would, please, what item you're speaking to on the agenda. And then you will have 3 minutes, and our clerk will set the time when you've finished your name and address. And let me look at my notes here, because I think the yellow light, it's green when you go up there. The yellow light appears when you have 15 seconds remaining. And when the red light goes on, your time is done. And if you would wrap up your comments, that's greatly appreciated. So we will start with Ashley Holland and Jesse Hill on deck.
Hi, I'm Ashley Holland, 2852 Depew Street. And I'll be brief. I'm here tonight as a representative of Local Works and also a resident of Wheat Ridge. And on behalf of Local Works, I would really like to thank the NRS Steering Committee, City Council, City staff, and the consultants for all of your hard work on this really robust report. The findings of the report show that we are all working for a vibrant and sustainable Wheat Ridge, which is, of course, Local Works' mission. And Local Works is really excited to partner with all of you on this important work moving forward. As a resident, I'm particularly excited about the neighborhood-specific aspect of the report, and I look forward to getting involved in any way possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jesse Hill and Celeste Turner on deck.
Thank you, Mayor. As you mentioned, Jesse Hill, live over in 2995 Chase Street in District 1. Excited about this draft NRS is out. One big concern, though, and I'm not, really appreciate what the group did to put it together, but there's a recommendation in it that that they're going to punt or recommend 2 years delay on ADU units or accessory dwelling units, and it's unfortunate because council's the one who punted that back to them to look at, and it really probably, in my view, wasn't a great decision for them to do, and it's unacceptable to keep delaying this year after year. A quick little background, 8 years is how long I've been coming up here just trying to get council to vote or do something on ADUs out there, and it just keeps pushing out time and time again. There are hundreds of ADUs in Wheat Ridge today. They're especially District 1, and we live in peace, and people live there and have great housing opportunities and diversity. But every night they go to bed not knowing if it's going to be legal or illegal for them to reside or to have a renter or have family members live with them. And farther on the background, it's Wheat Ridge over there. We got platted turn of the century. My home built in 1938. It's got a basement ADU on the drawings, original blueprints. When I went to do an upgrade, I was told, no, you can't put a stove down there. You can't put things for an ADU, even though it's on the plans, okay? And many neighbors have ADUs out there. Time goes on, more are built, more people have family members and friends live with them. City gets founded in 1969, 50 years ago. We continue to build out. Standard land use codes get adopted, and at some point, the language gets in there. ADUs now are not legal in the zoning code. And from all my research in the code, I can't find that meeting or where that happened on purpose. It just did. And from that point, we've moved on and again built houses and people live there. The neighborhood NRS study was done, recommended that we look and address this a decade ago and add this out there in our community. And other cities around the Denver metro area is taking it up. Golden, Denver, Lakewood, you name them, are taking it up. Except, unfortunately, for Wheat Ridge, and other councils in the past have punted it. So I welcome the new faces to council. This is your challenge. Please don't punt it to the next council. This is your opportunity to do it. And if you really don't want to, all you have to do is modify like 2 lines of code to just bring it back, to remove this ADU prohibition out there. And at very least, us in the neighborhood in District 1, where we were platted there and we've had them, like, allow us to continue that way of life out there. There's lots of options we can do besides having to develop a big advanced code around ADUs, but at least have something to help us happen this year, not 2 years, not 3 years, not 4 years down the line, if it happens. Or vote and just say no and get it on record. But I really would like to encourage going there. Besides that, great job on the rest of the team on the NRS. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Celeste Turner and Christine Disney on deck.
Hello, I'm Celeste Turner, 6985 West 26th Avenue, District 1. And again, want to further emphasize the compliments that have come together with this NRS. I think it's a very comprehensive, robust analysis. I think the level of community input that was solicited was warranted and appropriate, and I'm very appreciative of that. I also, echoing other comments, am very excited to see the effort to identify and engage at a neighborhood level and be able to create that sense of neighborhood within Wheat Ridge. I think that's very important. I also would like to encourage some additional focus on ADUs. I think the own demographic data that came out through the NRS shows that there could be real advantages to having ADUs, at least within certain neighborhoods in the city. So I would ask that you do consider that and not abandon it entirely for another 2 years. But otherwise, definitely appreciate the recommendations that are there and the focus on 38th, 44th, and that improvement and that sense of community. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Christine Disney and Kathleen Martel on deck.
Christine Disney, 3940 Balsam Street. I thank council for the opportunity to speak tonight. I was a member of the steering committee and attended every single event that we conducted in order to gather data for this report. And I want you to understand that in the gathering of that data, and I consider myself to be a good observer, we were very careful to talk to as many people as we could in an unbiased way to truly get a good sense of what the citizens of this community wanted. The report, for me, had no surprises. I feel like it very fairly and accurately represents what the citizens in our community want. I take issue with another member that was on our committee that said it wasn't gathered in a scientific way. I'm not sure how you make it scientific. It's very much a grassroots kind of an effort where you sit down and you really talk to people. And we had many meetings where we unpacked the data that we gathered to make sure that everybody completely understood that what we were recording was what we heard. We didn't add any bias. My only disappointment with the report is the 2-year listening tour. I feel like we did a listening tour for the last year. I feel like if we put off any of the changes or the recommendations for another 2 years, we're going to lose a big opportunity. I feel like get somebody on staff, have your meetings start working, but let's not draw it out for 2 years. Let's be a little more agile in creating the change in this community that we need. I feel like we have to move forward. We have to do these things, make the multiple housing on the corridors, and let the people in each of the districts, in the communities, in the residential areas have a little more say of what happens. So if you're going to have a development, have somebody on staff that can go into those areas and talk to the community so they know what to expect, and we don't have the pitchforks and flaming torches at city council when it comes up to be approved. Have a little more engagement with your constituency before it happens. Other than that, I feel like our consultants did a fantastic job and they were a pleasure to work with, and the steering committee did a fantastic job, and I'm honored to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kathleen Martel and Genn on deck.
My name is Kathleen Martel, 6455 West 31st Avenue, District 1. So I've stood up here a couple times over the last year talking about the NRS committee. I was honored to be a co-chair of the committee, and it was such an amazing process. I've been in Wheat Ridge since 2000, so I've benefited from the first neighborhood revitalization strategy, but I wasn't a part of it. So being a part of this process for almost a year now has been enlightening, it's been educational, it's been fun, it's been a lot of work, and I really have appreciated all of that, and I really want to reiterate, I think particularly what Christine said, in that there were a lot of us on that steering committee, and we tried very hard to really reach out into the community and not only reach out broadly, but in multiple ways, and ask the same question multiple times, and the consultants will explain it better. But we really were thoughtful about asking similar questions, reiterating what we had heard, checking for clarity, and the two big recommendations that came out of the NRS really didn't surprise me, and I'm really excited about, and I really hope that some thoughtfulness is put into this distinction between our neighborhoods and our corridors. Similarly, or around the same time, we've had a lot of things in front of City Council about zoning and about ADUs and about, neighborhoods wanting to maintain identity and change that's coming, and change is going to come. And I really hope that through this process, as a community, we can look at our corridors and our opportunities there, and also look at our neighborhoods and how we can be more involved and have more input in our neighborhoods. And I really think if that distinction and those opportunities can be capitalized on through the NRS, we will really have some great success out of this project. So thank you all again for impaneling the steering committee, for accepting all of us who applied. I think I've mentioned before, I was surprised by that, but I really think it made it so much more meaningful to have all of those voices represented. And I thank the City Council, I thank my co-chairs who are here, and everyone who participated, not only on the committee, but who attended and participated and answered our survey and had coffee with us and had beers with us and really gave their input. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Genn and Rachel Holton on deck.
Good evening. It's Genny with an I at the end.
Right.
I live at 4070 Field Drive in the Bel Air neighborhood. You've heard from many people in our neighborhood over the past 6 months or so about concerns about zoning and subdividing lots. And I think we've been waiting and kind of been pointed to the neighborhood revitalization strategy as a way where we might start to bring some neighborhood-specific thinking to the council, and I look forward to that. I enjoyed reading the report. I think it's a interesting and a thorough and a good roadmap for the city. It strikes me as being very oriented towards progress and not as oriented towards conserving the things that we like. There's a chunk at the beginning that talks about how much people like living here, and then there's a lot of talk about change, which I recognize is coming, and I embrace it in a lot of ways. I think my main concern echoes the previous two speakers, which is I appreciate the interest in engaging the neighborhoods. I was pretty concerned at the idea that this would be a 1 to 2 year process. Not that I don't think we have a year or two worth of things to talk about, but I don't want it to be used as a way to defer making decisions that need to be made in the near term to protect what we have while we think about how we want it to change. 2 years it's a lot of change can happen in 2 years, and I've lived through that kind of change where we had exactly the situation. The city of Denver delayed thinking about rezoning a neighborhood that I lived in for multiple years, and in that period of time, 2 or 3 years, all of the change happened. So at that point, there was no point in rezoning because all of the change had happened in what might have seemed like a short period of time when you get together relatively infrequently. I know it seems frequent to you guys to talk about it, but that time can go by quickly, but a lot of change can happen even in the 2-year period. So don't use it, please don't use it as an excuse not to make decisions in the meantime, even if we revisit them through the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Rachel Holteen.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Rachel Halton, and I am one of 3 co-chairs of the NRS Steering Committee, one of, I think, 26 members that were impaneled. And I am incredibly excited to be here tonight. When we first started this process, when we were impaneled last July and had our first meeting, like right around July, August, it was a lot of energy in the air, a lot of anticipation, and really not necessarily having a great idea of what it was that we were tackling. We were shot out of the gate pretty forcefully. I say that with love to our consultants. And it was apparent at the very beginning that we were really tackling some pretty big issues and big questions. And our process really asked us at the beginning to start high level and to, instead of focus on data points, focus on stories and collect qualitative input about what's important to our neighbors. And it's so easy in a process like this to fall back on quantitative data. But what we did is talk to our neighbors and we listened to them. And through that process, certain things that seemed really important and huge last September turned out to not necessarily translate at the city level. So when we sat around small tables and listened to people express concerns around code enforcement, it was really easy in September to say, whoo, we were just a really big code enforcement problem. But then when we asked the city at large, do you feel like lack of code enforcement negatively impacts who we are as a community? Overwhelmingly, we learned, well, we all have that one neighbor we don't like, but as a city, it's not our biggest issue. So I'm really impressed that the NRS report that's before you tonight did a good job of identifying those key issues. And it was done through a really, I think, rich, I don't even know the right term. It was a really rich bouquet of data, conversations, talking to different stakeholders, listening to city council, listening to staff, listening to community members. I don't love everything in it. I'm one of the steering committee members, and I'm a citizen. There are things that I really wish had gotten in there that didn't. If everything in there was what I loved, then it would be my NRS, and no one else would probably like it that much. But what we have, I think, is a really good representation of where Wheatridge is right now, and it doesn't set forth such an ambitious vision of what we're trying to become. What it does is it assesses what are our strengths and what are some things we need to do a little differently to become the best version of those strengths. And I take a lot of confidence that while I don't love every line in it, I'm really in love with the vision and the rich understanding of who we are holistically as a community. And I too hope we rest more on the 1 year than the 2-year recommendation, because I know we're all really eager for Wheatridge to flourish and to become an even better version. And I, like a previous speaker, I hope we don't lose our quirkiness along the way. And what I learned in this process, we're not going to lose that because the quirky shows up if you like it or not. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all of the speakers that I have signed up to speak, but it's not too late. If you would still like to speak under public comment on any item that's on the agenda, I'd be happy to have you come to the podium now and speak. Is there anyone here that would like to do that? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. We'll close our public comment portion, and we will go then into agenda item number 1, the Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy Update. Mr. Goff, give us a little introduction on this one.
I will introduce it, or maybe I'll have Ken Johnstone introduce it. Are you ready to introduce it? Well, you heard from a lot of speakers tonight of why we're here this evening, and yes, it has been about a year process. And to go back in history a little bit, the city did a neighborhood revitalization strategy back in 2004, 2005, and for different reasons at that time. It's almost 15 years ago now, so things have changed quite a bit. And I was just talking to our consultants a little bit before the meeting that, this report is a lot different. The first report that came out, and our community development director, Ken Johnstone, says a lot that one of the reasons he took this job was because of that first NRS report, and because it was very meaty. It had a lot of recommendations in it of how to move the city forward or how to keep the city sustainable. This report's different, and we're excited about it, but it is going to take some different ideas and I think challenges to move forward. But we're excited to have that discussion with City Council. So we have two of our members of our consultant team here tonight, but Eric Amy and Thomas Eddington. I was going to call you Edison again, sorry. Almost did. Thomas Eddington. And they have a presentation to go over the report, and then we'll open it up for questions, I believe, at the end. Eric, are you starting? Yeah. Okay.
Thomas does travel with his own light bulbs, but that's a different story. Okay, thanks to everybody for having us back again. I want to just, we'll get to it when we get to it. Let's do that. The deal in the slides tonight in the presentation is that we have streamlined a lot of it. And so when we met with the steering committee back in late April to present this nearly page by page on slides with questions and everything else, took us 2.5 hours to get through that. And we don't have that kind of time tonight. So we're going to sort of beg your forgiveness up front and let you know that we have streamlined some things. Every single thing that you might find interesting or want to talk about might not be there. It doesn't mean that you can't interject and ask a question. We also understand that while we're here talking with you, council, that there's a bigger audience that's hopefully paying attention to this. And so if there's something in particular that you think is of public value that you feel we've glossed over in some way or given short shrift to in our presentation, please just stop and say, okay, but what about, page 17? There's something I want to ask about. I want to get that out on the record. We can certainly do that, okay? And I think what will work best is feel free to take a small risk here and say, feel free to interject with questions as you have them. Don't hold till the end because you don't know if we're going to get to your thing or how that's going to work. So let's just take it as we go, and if we've got to sort of catch up at the end, we'll make that happen. Before we start, we just want to thank all the right people, including our steering committee who worked so hard. Rachel and Kathleen and Corey in particular, our co-chairs who were instrumental in sort of helping us herd these cats along the way. But nobody in this committee was any less important than that. So everybody made their contribution along the way. I think you heard Christine say she showed up to nearly every event, and there were many. So it wasn't just the outside engagement things at coffee shops or at open houses, but it was also Saturday mornings that were not scheduled for any of us, and we said we need to get together and talk about some of these things. So all these folks that gave their time generously, we could not have done it without them. And of course, this, Patrick and this Ken and Lauren, who is mercifully on vacation, we thank them, could not have done this without them. And Planning Commission, we spent a couple nights with Planning Commission getting their feedback and sort of not just channeling their themselves in their role as planning commissioners, but also having a certain role in representing the community as well. So bouncing things off them was helpful. But we do want to in particular thank the council because we know we've taken up a lot of your time in the last year and we appreciate it. And specifically, we really appreciate the ability, the chance to have sit with you at the retreat and have that conversation in April, because that was a critical thing for us in this project to understand, okay, what are some things that maybe we haven't gotten to? What are some opinions that you've got or your views on capacity to do these things? If we hadn't have had that originally unscheduled opportunity, we wouldn't be where we are now. Some things I want to say up front. This is a strategy, okay? So we're trying to define an overall aim here and think about allocating finite resources to achieve that. And if you remember the last time I think we were here, we talked about the 80-20 rule. 80% of your efforts come from 20% of your inputs, and 20% of your efforts come from 80% of your inputs. And thinking through sort of what the width of the pipe really is for a city government, a city organization, and a community to be smart about where we are investing our time. So what it's not there for is a comprehensive solution to everything. Okay, so some of the speakers from the committee talked about kind of how wide a net we cast at the beginning of this project, and that was to sort of figure out what was on the minds of the community and what was really important. Some things sometimes seem important, and then they turn out, you know, in the grand scheme of things, not to be. That doesn't mean that there are not important things that might fall by the wayside and find their place later. It also doesn't mean that there aren't things that are highly important to one person or 75 people. But the question we're really asking is, for the community as a whole, what are the most important things? And then there's just other things where the timing isn't right. So, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But not everything that's important is incredibly urgent. And so some things can wait till later. We have as a firm, we have a bias toward implementation. So we're always thinking about how do we leave a community with the ability to, so tomorrow morning, right? So we have this meeting tonight. We're not gonna, I know you're not gonna adopt tonight, but let's just say you are going to adopt tonight. Hypothetically, tomorrow morning, Ken and Patrick come into work and they have to start doing something, right? How do we get to work on this? And so we're always thinking about that. Some of that comes from those of us who have had city staff jobs before, right, and feeling like we would want that if we were in their chairs. And the other is just philosophically understanding that being able to make progress, tangible, concrete progress towards something imperfect is better than making no progress towards something perfect. That's just sort of how we view it. And the timeline matters too. So, you know, this is not a 25-year document. We don't view it as a 25-year document. We don't know what 25 years out looks like. We really don't know what 10 years out looks like, right? What was 10 years ago? 2009? If we were all sitting here in 2009, we'd be having a very sort of different conversation with different expectations given the nature of the economy at that time, given the nature of the housing market at that time. You know, we probably wouldn't have seen 2019 coming in the way that it's developed. So we want to just note that. And just be thinking about, you know, what is it we can actually get done in 10 years, realizing that sort of the older I get, I realize how much time that's not really. This is a document that is highly responsive to community sentiment. We had a bit of a non-traditional charge here. So usually as consultants, we're invited in, or we invite ourselves in through a proposal process. And there's a really clear thing that has to get dealt with or has to be addressed. And this was a bit of a different project. Patrick called us and said, hey, will you kind of go out and see what's going on out there? You know, go talk to the community and see what they're thinking and feeling. Are we generally going in the right direction? Are we not going in the right direction? What are the thoughts and feelings on growth and development? Is it more of the, should we do more of the same? Should we change direction? What do people think? And so that led us to approach the project differently, which is to be very, very open-ended and very inquisitive on the front end, and sort of to, in some ways, bring our objective analysis to it, but also to leave it by the wayside if it wasn't going to send us in the right direction, as the community would define that. Heard about the committee process, talk a bit more about that. We mostly were facilitators in this process. Again, a somewhat different role for us. Not being asked to be experts necessarily in everything, but rather to be questioners and facilitators of group process to get people to tell us what they thought. And the result of that is less big vision, as Patrick talked about in the beginning. Partly it's because 2005 was such a different time, and Wheat Ridge was in such a different position then versus where it is now. The economic conditions were different. The city's previous inability to compete up to that point was a big, big thing that was hammered home in the NRS. But we have objective data now that tell us that that's not the case in the same way anymore, and that's good news. The other thing is that what we heard from the community was, we don't feel like we're existentially threatened in any way. We think life's pretty good in Wheat Ridge. So that is a theme that is woven all through our work in this process and all through this document. It is we try to be clear about it in the document, but it's a major, major assumption that I think everybody needs to understand. What that does mean, though, is when you get to that point of maturity in sort of the competitive landscape, you've got a different job to do. Our colleague Charles talks about it as catching up versus keeping up. And the job of catching up is very different from the job of keeping up, right? Doesn't mean it's not hard work, but it's just different. And it doesn't involve as many big leaps forward, and that's what this document reflects. So, echoing Rachel's comments from a few minutes ago, this is, if just left to our own devices, if we had not approached the project this way, if we had not gone out and asked Wheat Ridge, what's going on, what do you think, what do you feel, we would have brought you back something very, very different. And just as Rachel said, her version might not be the version anyone else likes, our version might not be the version anybody else likes either, right? And we know that if we had done that, it would have gone over like a lead balloon. So we tried to interject very little in content, except where we felt it was either necessary or helpful. This document is restrained and practical. We think that matches the mood that we found in the community. A couple places where we did sort of exercise our authority as consultants. We said, listen, we're not going to put something in this document that we don't think is going to jive with what the public thinks at large, right? And that doesn't mean that you're not going to find 10% of people who say, you totally got this wrong. But we were looking for what's the 65%, right? So that's kind of what we were aiming for. And if we felt like we could in good conscience say that we had done that, then it could go in. And if we couldn't get there, then we weren't going to allow it to be in. And the other one was, again, implementability, feasibility. Can this be done? Can the city do this? Does it have the capacity? Can it be done in the amount of time we're talking about? These are things where we really said we're kind of drawing a hard line. I'm not going to ask this question. I'm going to assume everybody read this document down to the last period and semicolon. But in case you haven't read it, for those who haven't read it, there are some things that we just want to say up front. If we had given you, again, a document that didn't have so much public input reflected in it, it would probably have a more elegant narrative thread. This one doesn't. We admit it. We think that's okay. It's more of like a kit of useful parts. Okay, so there's a variety of sections in here. They are, at the very least, loosely connected, in some cases more tightly connected, but certainly all of them serve some purpose and could be useful in a standalone way. But it is, above all, focused on getting some things done. The document is organized in 5 parts. We've got background and process. We've got Wheat Ridge by the numbers. It's a lot of data, and some of that from the community, some of it from objective sources, but sort of painting the picture of where Wheat Ridge is. We've got a section in there on Wheat Ridge neighborhoods. We have the substance of the thing is in the priorities section, number 4, and then all the recommendations are summarized in the end, in the summary of recommendations. So again, back to the streamlining, where we're going to spend most of our time tonight is number 4 in the priorities section, because that's really what everyone cares about, okay? So we've been through this a little bit. The 2005 NRS was a full-scale community improvement plan. I think Patrick called it meaty, very meaty, very substantive, had a lot of things in there, numerous accomplishments since then, and those are on, I believe, page 7 of the report. I'm not going to go through all those now, but there's a pretty long list. I think, Ken, we got nearly everything in there, right? And again, we talked about the difference in the context, right? And so what we sort of landed on is, through this process, is the new question. You know, the question to ask in 2005 was, how do we compete in the region? The question now is, how do you maintain fundamental values and character while managing inevitable change, right? We like Wheat Ridge mostly the way it is. We're not looking for a drastically different Wheat Ridge, but at the same time, we also recognize that things are changing. Sometimes things change a lot, sometimes they change a little, but it's the march of time. Back to our process just for a minute. I remember sitting, I think, in this chair about just after Easter of last year and describing this process, and the mayor said, that sounds like a lot of work, I don't want to do that. Don't put me on that committee. And the mayor was right, actually. It was a lot of work, and it was about 9 or 10 months of pretty intense work on the part of the committee in partnership with us. And we kicked off in last summer. I think late July was the first time we met with them, getting them up and running as a group, as a steering committee, getting to know each other, getting to know us, understand how we were going to work together, what this project was going to be about. We sent them out in the fall to do a series of kind of small-scale conversations in the community, some of them less structured, some of them more structured, but just trying to pull that information out of the community about where people were, what they were thinking. We sat with you in the Planning Commission back in November and shared some of our early insights and capped off that first phase, that long first phase, with an open house in December. We had over about 110, 112 folks, really good turnout, and that was a really key turning point for us in either validating the direction that things were headed or telling us, no, you kind of got it, we don't really care about that, or you're kind of asking the wrong question there. So that was really important, and we took that to heart. We really did, trying to figure out if we were barking up the right trees or not. And then went into the winter and started to think about how do we actually begin thinking about addressing these things that have been raised by the community. And we used the survey to help us with that, as well as to continually validate some of the things we've been finding. We had over 1,000 respondents, which is a record for our firm in terms of percentage of population. So normally if we get about 1 or 2%, we're happy. 1,000 is more like 3+% here in Wheat Ridge, so we were thrilled, over the moon about that. Again, we were working sort of behind the scenes and with the committee in January and February to make sense of all this, but the end of March was another critical turning point in the project with what we call Blitz Week. We sat with you on a Monday night, and then we had 2 open houses the next day, and then we had 2 open houses the next day, and then we capped it off with Planning Commission on Thursday night of that week. And that was really where it was sort of gut check time for us, like, are we on the right track? Are we not on the right track? Because we're about to go write this thing. We want to make sure that the content is right. And then that brings us to sort of the end of it, where we've been using this time to put this document together. This is one of those streamlined sections. So there's a fairly robust part of the report that has a lot of the data findings, a lot of survey results, both from your resident survey from 2018 and from our survey from earlier this year, and then other sources like MLS real estate data and census data and some data local to the city of Wheat Ridge. I'm not going to run through all that tonight. I do have some slides. If you've got questions about it or you want to talk through anything, we can do that. But it's pretty lengthy, and so we're just going to talk about the main findings here. And those findings were that Wheat Ridge residents are largely satisfied. Your market has been strengthening, as we've talked about. The main place where that shows up is in your real estate market. But those resulting real estate investments that we've been seeing around town have some implications. And the implication is that change is positive, but also can create some discomfort, right, as we've talked about. And so therefore, building the capacity to manage that change that is not going away, that's what we need to be thinking about. The other thing, as a practical matter, is that Wheat Ridge's building stock is, a lot of it is over, approaching 100 years old, but nearly all of it is at least 50 years old. And it just is, especially after sort of a period of lack of investment in the last part of the last century, let's say the last 2 decades of the 20th century, it's in need of some TLC, right? It needs a new lease on life. That's really important. So your businesses aren't going to function if the buildings don't work. People aren't going to want to live in the houses if the houses don't work. It's as simple as that. We'll talk more about that and why that's important and what we think about it as we move on. I also want to say, although we did pull all the data slides to save time tonight, it's interesting to note, I think important to note, that the value of the home investments that people have been making here is on a steady upward march, right? So that means 2 things. Number 1 is that as property values rise, people say, well, okay, if my property value is higher, I'll put more money in because I feel like I'm protected in that case. It also just means, though, that there's a confidence about the future, there's a willingness to spend money and buy quality where maybe that wasn't the case previously. So that's a really good thing.
Could I ask you a question about that
Sure.
a little bit? Thank you. We're in the midst of a change here, and as you go forward, I'd like you to try and talk a little bit about macro versus micro observations, okay? Not too many years ago, our federal government was telling us that 1.5 GBD increase every year was the new norm. Well, we know that's not necessarily true right now. But as of, for instance, like the development at the Lucky's site, that's set stagnant for 8 years or whatever, but when the last dealer car ship moved out, the recession hit. So we're on the cusp here of some changes, both economically and demographically in the nation. And we keep referring back to national trends, but can we also adapt ourselves to our local niche, even as far as like metro trends? You know, can we carve out a niche for Wheat Ridge to maintain our individuality and successfully carve out that niche and still retain our identity? I mean, how do you look at those different, moving forward, the change in economics, the change in demographics, and also giving ourselves an identity that isn't the same as the rest of the world? How does that going to fall into place here?
Well, potentially we could go down a long rabbit hole, Larry, because you just asked me about macroeconomic trends, and that's not a thing you want to do. I just asked Thomas. But we'll talk about that over drinks later. But it's...
You're on.
You need an ethics waiver for that? So a few things, and I think it's an important set of questions, so I don't want to gloss over it and just jump ahead and say we'll get to it later. We don't know exactly where things are going to go, right? We can speculate, we can guess. There are a number of indicators that smart observers look at and say, well, we're certainly due for a recession, and that's going to have effects. What effects that's going to have in different metro areas, we can't tell you because we don't know how it's going to affect different industries and all that kind of stuff. Certainly, we know those things will happen at some point. We are in a sort of going into this weird period where, for instance, the working age population is not going to grow for at least a decade, right? And so we could be looking at low unemployment, low inflation. We could be looking at one of the things that I think is really interesting in our field, for those of us who study it, is the way that the macroeconomy has rewarded or punished different metro areas around the country. So I grew up in upstate New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, for instance, and those are places that have not seen the kind of real estate growth we've seen here in Denver, right? Attributable to a lot of things. But those places, in many ways, look very similar to the way they looked in 2005, right? Meanwhile, Denver Metro looks nothing like the way it looked in 2005. So we don't always know what those factors are that are going to determine sort of winners and losers. Now, within the metro area, I think this is your question, how do you preserve a unique identity? One of the things that I think concerns us as we travel around the country is that you can go anywhere in America and basically say, well, I know when that was built, right? So, and same thing happened here in Wheat Ridge. You can say, well, this section of Wheat Ridge looks just like this section of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Why? Because all the conditions that existed there in the same two places to make those places pop up at the same time, they look pretty much the same. We have a weird thing going on now, and I think it's something that people are going to regret, which is a lot of the development that's happening now, whether you find it in Denver, you find it in Boulder, you find it in Fort Collins, it looks just like Des Moines, Iowa, it looks just like Minneapolis, Minnesota, it all looks the same, right? And so it's the same thing's going to happen, is all those places that say, we're winning the battle for development today, in 25 years, everyone's going to know exactly what happened, and we'll see if that works out well or not. But there is a sameness to all of it. I think that people are going to not feel great about. When it comes to your community in particular, it's true that you can't live without the new, right? You've got to have some new coming in, but you also, I think one of the things we said in the report at a certain point is mostly the stuff you have is the stuff you're going to have. And so as much as we might be seeing a Lucky's, or we might be seeing one or two scrapes that get rebuilt under the bulk plain regulations, for instance. Those are actually pretty rare, you know? I mean, how many single-family homes do we have in Wheat Ridge? I think something like 8,000 or 8,500, right? And so it would take an enormous amount of redevelopment before Wheat Ridge stops feeling like Wheat Ridge. So that is all to say, it becomes really important, I think, Larry, what you might be asking is when we do new, if and when new arrives, how do we make sure that new is going to hold up over the long term, that new is not going to, we're not going to look at it and feel like it detracts from our community, but that it adds to our community, right? And some of that is in planning work, but so much of that is in sort of the sophistication of the development review process and what your design standards are and all those things. And Ken can speak to that more intelligently than I can, but that's where a lot of that stuff would get worked out. So sorry, that was a bit of a long answer to your question, but it had a lot of parts to it.
I just feel like we have a uniqueness now, and in some of our older neighborhoods, you know, you were talking about like, well, I can tell that house was built in 1955, but it's all brick. And I'm not saying all of them in this town are, but that could be a real advantage for us. And let's keep our eyes open to the fact that there's a lot of people that don't like painting their house. And so I just don't want us to lose sight of some of those things that we seem to be in this cycle of saying, well, that's the older stock of housing that we have is a detriment. Let's look at the glass as half full.
You've got a mix here. You got a very diverse mix here.
So,
some is.
And I believe, and I know there's some that, you know, I think there's a house near my neighborhood that just got condemned because the foundation's gone bad, but.
Some of it's going to go the distance and some of it is not.
I realize that.
Yeah.
So, but let's kind of look at, that helps give us some uniqueness that you won't find, the diversity. I mean, if I go out for drinks with you, I can find my house. I don't have to count 6 houses on the left from the intersection because they all look alike. And I think that we need to keep track of what our uniqueness has done for us and build on that a little bit too and not look at it as a detriment.
So now I will punt a little bit, Janice has a question, but let's make sure we come back to that because there's a good time and a place to talk about these kinds of things later on.
I just wanted to kind of add to what Larry was saying. Do you think that overlay zoning is kind of the way to address the kind of the issue of how do we do new without losing our identity?
You know, let's hold that for a second. We're going to be there in just a minute, okay? I'm going to blow through this a little bit. There's a section in the report. It's called Wheat Ridge Neighborhoods. It is a derivative of an exercise that we ran at the December open house. The reason we did it is because we couldn't really get a handle on how to break Wheat Ridge into pieces. You know, and some people would just say, well, you don't break Wheat Ridge into pieces. That's not something that we do here, and don't talk about it. That's a horrible idea. And I can certainly appreciate that, but from the perspective of people who are analysts of places, which is what we are and why you hire us, partly why you hire us, and for people who have to do work in the city going forward, we're trying to figure out a rational way to sort of organize our efforts. Otherwise, it just feels like whack-a-mole all the time, right? This block, that block, this block, that block. And what we're trying to work toward is a more rational system of thinking about different parts of the city and engaging with different parts of the city in a way that works for them and do it in an organized manner. So we didn't have a neighborhood map of a Wheat Ridge, and we asked, and it didn't seem to be a neighborhood map of Wheat Ridge in anybody's in City Hall or anybody's garage that they had drawn themselves, and so we asked everybody at the December open house to do that, and we got 85 different ideas of what neighborhood boundaries ought to look like. And so we said, okay, well, instead of banging our head against the wall trying to figure this out for the next 8 months, let's just take a stab at some and be arbitrary and be honest about that. And so we took those 85 different maps and we tried to synthesize it into something that made sense. And we ran it by the steering committee and they said, looks as good as anything we would do. And if we don't want to keep it later, we don't have to. And we brought it, I think, to you all at the April retreat. And you sort of said, interesting. Okay, we're not going to commit to that, but thank you. And we just sort of used that as a way to organize some data as a potential way to think about the city going forward. We are not bound to this. We don't care if you drop this map in the trash. But the point we're trying to make is come up with some kind of map that gives you some way to organize your efforts as it relates to neighborhoods going forward, okay? In the report, you will also see connected to this a variety of data presentations. And the first thing we did was sort of a dashboard. We picked a handful of indicators, not every indicator that you could pick, maybe not every indicator that somebody else who's not us would pick, but we thought within the Wheat Ridge context that these were things that kind of mattered. And we displayed them across those 8 neighborhoods that we defined. And those indicators, for those who haven't read it, is turnover rate. That's sort of how often are single-family homes changing hands in these neighborhoods. And actually, let me just back up for a second. The data that you're seeing here is all single-family properties. And we did that for 2 reasons. Number one, because even in big cities across America, the majority land use is actually single-family neighborhoods, okay? So it won't tell you every single thing about the neighborhood, but it'll get you 90% of the way there. The other thing is that it allows us to do apples-to-apples comparison. So if we've got one neighborhood that is, if we were running the data for not single-family properties and we had like a big multifamily in one place, we didn't have it somewhere else, or we had a big institution in one place, we didn't have it somewhere else, it might skew things, so that kept us apples to apples. So turnover rate, the land value versus the improved value. The reason that that's important is because when land values start to creep up in relation to improved values, which is the structure, the building that's on the land, then you start to know you're getting in the realm of redevelopment territory. And the best thing I can point you to right now is Edgewater, where most of the structures in Edgewater you wouldn't put, are not in great shape, but the land is very valuable. And so I would anticipate that, and you can go to blocks in Edgewater and you can see scrapes and redevelopments. And the more that the market strengthens, I think the more of that you'll see in Edgewater. Code violations, so you know where our property conditions tend, possibly deteriorating. Major permits, where is investment happening, and what's the value of those permits? To what extent is investment happening? So all those things are displayed in there, and they're displayed not just in a dashboard in comparison to each other, but also there's a nice kind of single page for each one of those 8 areas for those who like that kind of thing. And it's important going forward because it sort of establishes some baselines. So if you wanted, you could, we can give all this methodology and data to the staff and say, in 5 years, just recreate this with current data, and then you'll know, how have we progressed. That's what those sort of individual neighborhood profiles look like. Okay, so this is really kind of the substance of the thing tonight, is the priorities section of the report. And as we've talked about, a lot here tonight, what we're really trying to figure out is how do you take this basket of issues, which is kind of where you start, right? You get this basket of issues, you start to think about a variety of ways we might respond to these issues. What is one specific intervention for one specific problem, or what is sort of one bigger solution for a collection of issues, whatever it might be, but just start to organize it, and organize it in such a way that you can actually take action on it. So that's what we see as being the trick in our work. In summary, the things we're going to run through here tonight is sort of 4 main things that came out of this. The first being neighborhood engagement as change management, and this is the idea that going to talk to neighborhoods, engage neighborhoods where people where they live at that scale, talking about things that are specific to them, important to them, near where they live. The investment in selected primary corridors. That's not, we didn't bring that, that's not fresh, that's something the city's been doing for a while, but that remains very important. Third thing is the deprioritization of ADUs, and we'll talk about that as well. And then customer service enhancements, back to, you were talking earlier about just the need for property investments in Wheat Ridge, both on the residential side and on the commercial side. And we don't have a criticism of the way we were just doing that, but it's a continued emphasis and a continued search for improvement and making sure that the city's got the best possible environment when it comes to those rehabilitation projects, which are often difficult, complex. It's not the same as new construction. So as we've talked about, this is the first one, building resident capacity to manage change. Change is both opportunity and it's also discomfort. We got to manage the change. Managing can be, by the way, it can mean stopping change. It can mean making change faster. It can mean making different change. It's not necessarily a one definition word here as it relates to this topic. So I just want to be clear about that. Managing change is not the same thing as automatically saying, we want more change, how can we get change faster, right? Some places will say, the way we manage change is we put moratoria in place. That's how we manage it, right? That's something that has been done before. But the main thing is just to get in front of it and to be proactive. And so one of the things that we heard in this process, sometimes it was articulated very literally, people saying, we want control. We feel like we don't have control. And other people would say things that it wasn't literally we feel out of control, but they were saying that same thing. And we didn't take that necessarily to mean put our foot on the brake, stop everything, we don't want anything to change. We took that to mean we want a voice, we want a say in it. These things feel like they're happening to us. Nobody asked us if we wanted this, there was no process, it just one day something happened, right? And that was very, very uncomfortable. And then it happened another time, and I don't know how many more times it's going to happen, and I don't know if it's ever going to stop or when it's going to stop. And so I just don't feel like I've got any ability to influence that. So that's sort of our description of why change management is needed. We've been banging the drum as consultants, as outside experts a little bit for this neighborhood planning concept over time, and a couple things have popped up that have influenced our way of thinking about that. One is simply being smart about deploying that. You couldn't tomorrow, even if you said, yes, Thomas, we love your neighborhood planning issue, when can we start? You couldn't pull it off citywide right away. It's a potentially big effort, right? The other is that we were very sensitive to the conversation we had with you all in April at the retreat, and you said, that's maybe a neat idea, and we might go that direction potentially, but that also could be a bit far off, and do we want to commit to that right now? Is there a starting point, right? Is that where we start, or is that where we might get to? And what does a starting point look like? And that's where we came up with the idea of the listening tour. So you remember we had the conversation on that day, and a lot of it was about communication, and it was about discussion and conversation and meeting people where they are and adjusting outreach strategies and communication strategies to be more customized to at a neighborhood scale. And that was something that made a lot of sense, right away, and made sense faster than neighborhood planning might make sense as a formal system. And so we said, well, how about the citywide neighborhood listening tour? And what that would allow you to do up front is to better understand what matters to residents, allow neighbors to define the problem. I want to stop here and talk about this a little bit because it's something that the more experience we get, I think, professional experience, life experience, one of the things that we as professionals are prone to doing sometimes is walking in and saying, we know what the issue is, right? So whether it's us as consultants or whether it's city staff or even you all in your chairs, there are a lot of avenues for things to end up in your lap. And then you have to deal with it in some way, right? And it might come to you through a constituent complaint. It might come to me through census data. But it will cause me to say, well, I know what the problem is, right? And then we'll walk into a meeting and say, we've defined the problem. Don't worry, now we can work on it, right? Except the wisdom of this process was that it kept us from doing that because if we had only paid attention to sort of our data, our analysis up front, we would have not defined the problem properly as the community defined it, right? So we would have said, wow, you've got some challenges here. You've got some things you need to continue to work on. It would have been sort of the original NRS Part 2. And when we went and talked to the community, we realized they don't see it that way. That's not the problem that they perceive, to the extent that they perceive a problem, right? So we were saved from ourselves as outside experts by forcing ourselves to listen to the community. And we think that doing that more intentionally and more frequently here in Wheat Ridge might help unearth some things. We were surprised. We learned a lot of things we didn't know. I hope the committee would say the same thing. Some of them were those known unknowns, which is to say we knew there was an information gap for ourselves and we had to go fill it. And then there were things that were gaps we didn't even know existed that the community told us about. So it's really, really important, and we think that that'll go a long way. Engage in a neighborhood level, again, meeting people where they are. Neighborhood planning later if it's appropriate. We think that this is going to require a couple of people to do this. And I want to also say here a couple of things. Number one, we don't think you hire 2 people just to do this. If this is, whether this is 6 weeks of work or 2 years of work, you wouldn't hire 2 people to do this. There is inevitably going to be a lot of things that come from, if you do this, if you follow this recommendation and you do what we're talking about, a lot of things will come from this. There will be a variety of sort of asks from the community and commitments potentially that the city enters into in terms of staff time given to, I don't know, coordinating special code enforcement efforts with the police department, or working with Public Works on capital projects or something that requires a new layer sort of human resources, right? And the other is that we've told Ken and Patrick ever since we sort of started germinating this idea that you want to hire people who are multi-talented and can fill a lot of different roles. So the city is a relatively lean staff. That's fine, that's great. And when you have that, you want to have people who can do a lot of things. So those are the kind of people that we're thinking about. And in terms of the listening tour, I think, we said, look, it probably will take a year, but don't take more than 2 for some of the same reasons that the speakers referenced, which is, well, wait a minute, you're telling me I got to wait 2 years for something to happen? We're not saying that you don't do anything else for 2 years. We would love you to go start taking action in various ways, whatever is appropriate, like next week, But if that may feel like a rush. It might feel like, we want to really understand what's going on before we take some action, before we make decisions, and that makes sense. But you can move as fast or as slow as works for the city. That's what the point we're trying to make. We think this has some support, that this would work, that people would like this because of some of the questions we asked in our survey and some of the answers that we got. So you've got majorities for feeling that small town life and knowing your neighbors is important, and feeling like city initiatives should be tailored to different parts of the city, different neighborhoods. People who feel like they would want to engage in a neighborhood organization if they had one, So this is we think this is a positive sign because these are positive feelings about we want to get engaged, we want to work with our neighborhoods. Another thing that we think is important and that we've observed in our time here is the need for the reestablishment of some basic education and public expectations around planning processes and how the whole spectrum of all the way from comprehensive planning down to the approval of a site plan, how those things are connected, and that it's not some mysterious black box that just gets done by people in the basement at City Hall, but that there's a sort of a rhyme and a reason to it. So if there's too many issues that have popped up, that predate certainly our involvement, but even have happened during our involvement, where we started scratching our heads saying, I'm not sure people really understand how these things are supposed to work. And that gets in the way. That becomes an issue on a lot of fronts, as you all know, because you deal with it here on Monday nights. But really key to that is helping people understand that most parts of this process, whatever that process, from the comp plan down to the site plan approval, have public input components, and there's sort of a time and a place for each kind, but that people don't always know kind of when and how they are. So this is not here because anyone needs to read this. I just want to put it up there so you know kind of what you're looking at. It's on page 38 and 39 of the report, and it lays out that continuum from high altitude, conceptual planning at the comprehensive planning level, all the way down to an administrative approval. What those things are, why they are, an example of which type of action fits into which bucket, and then how the public input works in each one. So partly this is just undertaking educational activities. May or may not be effective, because who wants to go to a seminar about how planning works? I'm sure Ken's a fascinating presenter, no criticism there, but it's probably a bit of a hard sell. I think what's more important is to start to think through, how do we actually put these things into action? How do we practice this continuum in a way that brings people into it? So I'm actually going to pause there, and because that was a lot. That's a lot. It's a big part of the report, and we went through it fast. And I think this is a good time to stop and maybe take some questions. Before we do that, I do want to get back to some things that Janice and Larry were asking about. Some of this is part of what could result from undertaking neighborhood plans, for instance, could be a neighborhood consensus that, we want to get rigid about how development or change is going to work in our neighborhood. I'm not advocating for it, I'm simply saying it could be an outcome. So for instance, it happens all over America through historic districts, right? Historic districts are, I'm not sure if you may have some here in Wheat Ridge, but they can be highly regulated depending on where you are. In places that, I came from a city in western New York called Geneva. We had the original downtown of that city dated to the turn of the century, from the 18th to the 19th century. And it was one of the only places outside the mid-Atlantic region or Boston where you'll find row houses, like these really substantial brick row houses. And if you were sort of an architectural historian, you'd go to this town and say, how did that get here? It shouldn't be here. Yet there it is. And many, many years ago, they went to great pains to create a historic district. It's both state and federal register listed. And there's an historic districts commission, and they sort of run everybody's life, and they tell you what you can and can't do, right? Now, what's the pro? The place looks the same as it looked 100 years ago. What's the con? You can't do anything there. It's very difficult, right? Or you've got to get it through this commission. So these are not decisions to be taken lightly. If you want to go, and that's an extreme example, obviously, Larry, to your question, but it's the kind of thing that can result. And if it's a grassroots thing, maybe that's what works for Wheat Ridge as opposed to top down. But you may also find that, well, we thought our neighborhood really was into preservation. We thought it really wanted to change, except when we started to explain to everybody what that would look like, they all started to, shift in their seats and say, well, I'm not sure I want to be subject to that regulation. I'm not sure I want, Thomas chairing that board and telling me what color I can paint my house. But those are the conversations that you can have on a highly localized basis that often are best had on a highly localized basis before they end up on your desk here at City Council, right? So that's one of the things that we think could come from this, that maybe it comes to nothing, or maybe it becomes really important, but we think that process of going through those conversations at the neighborhood level could be really helpful.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess one of my concerns regarding developing a program around a listening tour and going around along the lines of defining the problem is that, like, for instance, when my son wakes up in the morning, he says, "Dad, I'm hungry." I'm like, "Noted, thanks for telling me." Like, the other side of that is, so how are we going to solve that hunger? Are you going to make yourself breakfast? So in this realm, it's sort of, we can ask our residents to define the problem, but that doesn't mean that the solution we come up with to deal with that problem is going to be the one that they want to see have happen. So in devising this plan, I would like to see more concentration on how to involve the residents in the solution and the decision that's being made, so that when we're out there listening, they actually feel like we are listening because we took the steps that they asked us to take, or the solutions that they wanted to see presented. And I see in part of the report, it aptly describes development code is best written by professionals, and I get that. But as we look at this, going around asking people what the problem is isn't going to result in us doing anything different. We're just sort of listening to what people's complaints are. But how do we turn that into actionable and solution-oriented ways that the residents feel like they were actually listened to? Because that's my biggest concern about this entire listening process, is how do we know that we're actually going to input that?
Well, it's a good question. I want to say, as a general rule, that just because something maybe isn't in here doesn't mean it's excluded from possibly happening. So, for instance, if council had expressed a high level of enthusiasm in April and said, design for, bring us back a detailed plan on a neighborhood planning program, we might have gotten kind of down that road, if you will. But we broached it more conceptually to allow for the flexibility, for you to figure it out over time. So back to that general rule, a corollary to that is we think it's important to sort of set some ships to sea, in our planning documents, but not tell you exactly where to take them. So if we can launch this idea, it becomes really important for the city over time to craft it according to its own specifications. There will be things in 18 months that we can't foresee where Patrick and Ken and others on staff say, look, we've looked at this, we've looked at best practices, we called Eric and Thomas and Charles back and asked for questions, and we think we've got an improvement on what they proposed, or we've got a different idea that would work better. And we think that's fantastic. That's what you want to be doing. I do think also, Zach, that you raise an important point, which is when we go out and talk to people, if we don't do anything with what we hear from them, we're in trouble. And the answer is yes, you're in trouble. So the expectation is if you can't commit to, it doesn't mean you go out to everybody and say, hey guys, I'm here from the city and the checkbook's open, what do you want, right? Oh, and by the way, you can come vote for me next Monday night. Right. No, it's a mature city government like the one that you've got here will figure out how to partner with residents, properly set expectations, right? We tried to model some things in this process with the steering committee by saying up front, like, listen, there's 27 of you, there's 30,000 people out there, there's Patrick, who I work for, right? And we're gonna have to come up with something that's not gonna make everybody happy. That's the way it is. And so it's okay if at the end of this, you say, I like 92% of the NRS document, but I don't like 8%. That's just inevitable, right? So, and we knew that. And we said, well, ultimately, we've got the responsibility for putting something on paper and presenting it here tonight and giving to the community. So that kind of approach to the work that you do with neighbors, it's the same thing, which is if Ken hires a neighborhood planner, a really crackerjack, top-notch neighborhood planner, and she goes out to a meeting, first thing she should say is, me standing here is not a guarantee that all 50 of you are going to get everything you want when I walk out the door. That's not why I'm here. That's not the purpose of this meeting, right? We're grown-ups in a public setting, and so here's kind of how this works, right? And most people are okay with that if you're transparent up front, has been our experience. Hopefully it's been the experience here as well.
I guess sort of to follow up on that is that if Miterid says, we don't have enough gold-plated manhole covers in our neighborhood, then we think we should. Well, that's what our neighborhood plan is we want every manhole cover gold-plated. And like you said, the expectations have to be set on the front end, and that's what's concerning to me as we go forward in this. And I'd say, in addition to those concerns, the prescription of a particular number of staff is somewhat concerning to me, because that feels like a tactic, not part of the strategy. And I understand that resources have to be allocated towards engagement and outreach, but prescribing a set number of staff or staff in general seems to be a tactic and not at the strategy level, that I thought this document would be kind of be more on that level.
Right, and I would go back to my earlier comment, sort of about the feelings of commitment that we perceived in one direction. And your question is totally fair. I think, again, we try not to prescribe. We think you've got some work to do, the exact nature of that work. Maybe we don't detail as much. We do have a sense. We've been doing this for a long time. Some of us have done that actual job professionally, so we kind of know. We've got an idea in our mind of what the work entails, what the scope is, what the scale is, how long it takes. And what we know is that the staff you have now isn't going to be able to do it because they are up to their eyeballs in the stuff that they're already doing. So you also could go a different direction. You could say, I don't want to commit to 2 staff people or 1 staff person. I'm going to allocate more consultant dollars. We'll have consultants do that, right? If we want it done. You could do that. That's an option. We wouldn't recommend it for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's going to cost the same anyway. Number 2, what you're not doing is you're not developing an institutional system of neighborhood engagement, right? So you could call us back and say, can you guys talk to the community for a year. Can you come back and just go talk to the community for a year again? And I guess we would say yes, but I would say, but then at the end of that year, what are you going to do, right? Because all the relationships that have been built are now gone because we left. So if your residents come to know me or come to know Thomas and then our contract is over, it's done. If you make a commitment to a person, these are real human beings who are in this building every day. They're accountable on good days and bad days, in all the ways you want them to be. And they know people, and there are relationships with them, with people in the community, and that matters. That's important. Those human connections really matter. So sometimes that gets lost when we're having conversations about being really good stewards of public dollars. I get it. We get it. But it's human beings that make this stuff work. So that's why it's in there.
Mr. Matthews?
In regards to that, I had 2 questions, but about the listening tour. Let me start with this way. It seems to me that listening to the people, that should be our job. And rather than hiring 2 people, why can't we have 8 people? We have 2, we're already broken down by districts. Maybe council has to commit to the fact that we'll get together with planning and establish some ground rules of what we're trying to accomplish here, but then it's maybe up to us to get out and hit the bricks and have these neighborhood meetings, and at least you're assured that some of that, there's going to be at least a 4-year consistency there. Just because we hire somebody, if we were to hire somebody, there's no guarantee he's going to be here 4 years from now, but maybe it's a lack of us getting involved that's created this need from lack of listening. And I'd rather see them talking to to their elected representatives than another staff person, because there's already distrust to City Hall. How is that from your experience, do you think that would be a doable approach on these listening tours?
We don't see it as an either or, Larry, but rather as a both and. So, yes, it's important for elected representatives to connect with the people who they represent, no doubt about that. But it's also the case that the intensity of what we're talking about is quite high. The commitment is quite high beyond what a volunteer elected official can do in our estimation. And the other thing is that, and I'm sensitive to your comment about the distrust with City Hall, and we sort of sense that through our process a little bit too. And we think this is the beginning of an opportunity to start undertaking some systemic changes that alters that relationship. So that's kind of what we're getting at. I think some of the highest performing city organizations that we've seen, there's a partnership between the professional staff and the council where the council is comfortable with these types of professionals going out and doing that work in the community, and then coming into these settings like this and saying, and through their staff communications, et cetera, saying, we've really run this down. You know, we've had the right level of engagement, we've done the right type of engagement, and we feel confident telling you either that this is a decision you can move forward with, or this is something that we can't deal with right now, or whatever it is. But that level of honesty and transparency that comes from your professional staff, that's what helps make that work. So it's the symbiotic nature of that. That's what we would like to see. Does that make sense? Okay.
Mr. Pond and then Ms. Dozeman.
Well, let me just, I mean, part of this is just comment and dialogue based on what we're talking about right now, as long as that's okay, less a question. If not, I'll pass and come back later.
No,
but,
please.
Okay. You know, just to kind of frame this, I saw when this came to us in the last two times, neighborhood engagement, neighborhood change management being the kind of the driving force behind this one. And if I could, I'd just say that the listening tour concept perhaps came a little bit from what I'm hearing. I want to validate this off of the interpretation of the retreat and some of the, you know, basically we got into a conversation about overlay districts and sub-area plans and HOAs and a lot of different things, which at a point you say, hold on, time out. That's a lot of, you know, real stuff, and we don't have real direction on that level of detail. And in fact, if you wanted to do anything like that, or any one of those many things, you would have to probably go out, ask some questions, and listen first. And I think that this is responsive to that. I would also say that I think that what I take from these notes and how I interpret this is that it is, you know, listening in an active sense, that in fact listening in this context in my mind, and these staff, which I by the way agree with, you know, is about education of our process, in continuing to engage in a higher level, dealing with notification issues, you know, any 10 things that I could tell you that we just talked about 2 weeks ago at a meeting, you know, like that's what I think this effort can do. And so I would hope that it doesn't look, one, like passive and it's a listening tour and we're punting, because that's actually not how I interpret it. I think if we're committed to staff and committed to this, it's really saying, okay, let's really start to engage our neighborhoods as neighborhoods in a process of change that happens to be a planning process, and let's start to figure that out. And we need help to do that. I agree with that. So I don't want to look at it as, I think, you know, if listening tour doesn't strike the right tone, then we should rebrand it and make it feel a little bit better, because to me it seems like the right response. That's just where I'm at.
Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I kind of just want to piggyback on that. I definitely agree with the planning at a neighborhood level. I think that front-loading the process in targeted areas, I think would really help us policy-wise and really help to gain the trust of residents. My only concern with the listening tour, and it may be just kind of the way that you perceive something of that nature, is I really thought that this NRS was the listening tour. And granted, I realized that it was going to be more of an overall comprehensive plan as opposed to meaty details and talking about code enforcement and zoning and neighborhood issues. I am very hesitant to continue, maybe not punting, but having to garner so much more data and so much more input as opposed to laying the groundwork that we have right now. And it's, I think, really concerning to me that the change is already here. So it's already happening, and we're having to, because we didn't get ahead of that change when we could have, now we're seeing a lot of development, we're seeing a lot of issues, and those are happening in real time, whereas we're saying, okay, well, we're continuing this process of public input, and yet how are we addressing the change that is happening. I mean, and we have a ton of things going on in the near future that, like, how are we going to address those major developments if we haven't had the input from the public?
The best time to do all your planning was 5 years ago. The second best time is now. I think that your comment about, well, we didn't get ahead of X, Y, or Z is a really important comment, right? But it also, we would be concerned about rapid course corrections in response to being out of position, right? Sometimes the treatment can be worse than the disease in those cases. And I know as a practical matter that Wheat Ridge has had to do some of that recently, right? And it's not easy. It also doesn't mean that you can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So you may simply have times where you say, look, we are currently we have this thing before us. It's not going to wait, or we can't make it wait, and we've got to deal with it, right? And there may be sort of it's a rip off the Band-Aid moment in those cases, but you could also at the same time be getting ahead of whatever is next, right? Again, I don't think it's an either-or proposition necessarily. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy, and then Mr. Urban.
I think that a lot of the frustration that comes from our community is that things happen, and it will be something like, well, we didn't know. And a really good example of that would be in District 1 when we had the larger houses going up, and per our city charter, which is, the people's document, and it says that you can build up to 35 feet. And so we were following the zoning and codes that we have, and then all of a sudden the neighborhood was like, wait a minute, this is not what we want, and this is really shocking. And that's when we ended up, working like on the bulk plane. And so that's why I think that a listening tour, yes, is important, but I agree with we should be walking, chewing gum at the same time. These are the kinds of things that we need to be able to be agile enough to be able to change so that we can be responsive to our communities. And and I think that we have a few things that are already on our a future study session list that we're looking at, to kind of pay attention to that kind of stuff. And it's not all zoning. Some of it is like the Airbnbs, right, which is going to be coming up again for us to look at. And we've been talking to people in the community about what they think the regulations would look like, would look like. So I think that it's important for us to try to not get stuck on the listening tour and be like, let's do this for a year or two. But I think that we should look at how can we move forward while also listening and also having our citizens' best interest of their concerns in mind, and being able to address those without it being like a knee-jerk reaction. And then I also just wanted to say, I super appreciate every single one of our community members that donated their time and worked so hard for a year on all of these meetings and spent so much time putting this together and putting this document together for us. It was absolutely necessary. I appreciate the consultants. Thank you very much. But the citizens didn't get paid for this job, and so I really appreciate them showing up over and over and over again on it. And I think with this document and with our citizen survey that we have some really good stuff for us to be able to move down the road with, and some good roadmaps. So thank you.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess one of my concerns about this concept of neighbor engagement is that it lacks any real concrete, tangible outcomes, in the sense of, if we were to take a baseline today and say we have 20 individuals coming in to speak under public comment, we have X percent of the registered voters voting in elections, we have these various attendance to public meetings, various attendance to the rec center, these types of metrics that we could then say, over the next 2 or 3 years, we want to increase public participation in our governance by a certain amount or by a certain metric. That, I think, helps us understand the health of our engagement, not necessarily a concerted effort to go out into the neighborhoods, because again, going back to the Netflix analogy, they're looking at ways to put the emergency status bars and notifications on streaming services because people are just tuned out. They're not tuned into this for a variety of reasons. They're out earning a living, they're out taking care of loved ones, so whatever it may be. This presupposes the idea that residents have the bandwidth to get knowledgeable enough about this process to then engage at a level necessary to provide the feedback to the city so that they can take that and run with it. So I would like to see us focus on more tangible ways that we can increase the participation in a variety of different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a listening tour method, but that's where I would like to see us have more focuses on tangible, direct results that we can then go back and say, we've done better than we have in the past.
Mr. Matthews and then Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you. I'm kind of liking sub-area plans. I mean, I see advantage to that because I live in a district that's got a lot of different environments. Do you folks have any data or guidelines from things you've seen where this has been done before? And this is in regard, I've got two questions there, but 2 prongs here, but one is in regard to the actual boundaries of the sub-area plans. I'm trying to figure out where the curve crosses between having too many and having not enough. You probably can't micromanage the city into having every block have its own sub-area plan, but yet, like for District 4, I've got a natural barrier, the Clear Creek, and there is a distinct difference in the neighborhoods from one side of the creek to the other. And then I have Kipling, and there's differences from the east side of Kipling to the west side of Kipling. And then I've got people that are up next to Arvada. They're north of the railroad track. So my question is, and been trying to figure out how to say this so you can, do you have some kind of experience that tells you what kind of boundaries, I mean, like as a priority, for instance, in my district, Clear Creek would be boundary 1. And then, but going from Kipling to Wadsworth, that's pretty homogeneous until you start getting closer to Wadsworth. So, you know, a priority level of creating boundaries that helps you define without breaking it down and making it just an impossible task to manage.
Right. I think part of that is what are the issues you're trying to address? And so you may have, that would help determine your boundaries. If you were sort of doing it on an ad hoc basis, there are other places where, you know, Boulder, for instance, has some defined, they're called sub-communities, and they plan at that level, and they try not to do a sub-community plan until there's sort of enough going on, enough issues have arisen in a sub-community to do that plan, to update that plan. There's Des Moines, Iowa, they've got the entire city, nearly the entire city, broken out into 52 neighborhoods. That's a lot of neighborhoods to manage. And each one of them was, at least before we started working with them, was on a cycle to get a plan, you know, and there were sort of markers for indicators for when it was time to update the plan. And that's a lot of work to do. So I would say there's not a science to that. It's highly customized to your community, to the set of issues you're trying to deal with in any given small area. But that's also why we think that going out and talking and getting a much better understanding of what's going on the ground and what's on people's minds and what issues are driving their concerns would help you sort of understand and think through that. Okay. And I just want to, really quick on Zach's comment, designing the exact system is down the road from here on if you were ever to do this, but we absolutely are huge advocates of defining outcomes. You know, you're doing this why. Okay, what are we going to achieve, right? So we're at a certain level, a certain altitude here, and that would be one of those next steps, definitely.
Mr. Ramey, I had a question. We've had a lot of comments from our public comment this evening about postponing the discussion on ADUs. Can you please address that issue?
I can do that. Let's let's skip ahead to that section right while we're on that topic, and then we'll come back to the rest. How's that, Mayor? Okay.
Sure.
Just get myself oriented here. I appreciate the question. Let me take you through the prepared stuff first, and then we can maybe get back to some of the comments that we heard. This hasn't really progressed since we talked to you in April. What you see there on the left is the information that you garnered from your resident survey, showing levels of support. On the right-hand side is a slightly different way of asking it that we used at the community open houses in March. We were stuck by this issue. You know, we were flummoxed by this issue, and weren't exactly sure how to proceed. There was a time when, I think a meeting in early March, we were talking with the committee about could we issue sort of a separate memo that says, here's what we couldn't figure out, here's how to think about it, here are our potential down the line next steps. But we just sort of kept working it and said, well, you know, how do we get a level deeper? How do we do that? And we gave them the option of saying, it depends. And they could either say, these are attendees at the open house. I think we had maybe 75 or 80 people who engaged us on this conversation. So that's, as a percentage of those who attended the open houses, that's very, very high. That's great. But they were able to say, I unequivocally support ADUs with no reservations. If you had a reservation or you had a question or something, you weren't allowed to say yes. Okay, you had to go to the it depends category. That's how it worked. And so only 40 people said, yes, I don't care what you do, an ADU is great for me, right? I don't need to know anything else. Surprisingly small number of people said no. And then the majority were in it depends. What we found out when we allowed the it depends category is that something like, oh, it's on there actually, okay. So when it's grandma or your brother living in the ADU, you get very high levels of support. That's great. So the family connection is really important. If you're putting somebody who's in your family in that unit, people are fine with it, right? And I think that there is, I don't know the full understanding or the full history of the way it's been discussed here, but I think that familial angle has been played up, and in particular the aging parent. So that's kind of the prototype household for the ADU conversation is the aging parent. But there's also, as you all know, here in Wheat Ridge, there's something in the water that is a bit skeptical about rentals and is worried about neighborhood change. And what people told us through this conversation was, look, if you're just going to use it as a studio apartment in your backyard, then I'm not for that. Is the sort of undiplomatic, rougher version of what we heard. So we get that, right? If it's grandma, it's okay. But if it's me renting to some guy off the street named Thomas, that's not okay. Because now what's the difference between that and basically living having a duplex or being in an R2 district, as people might describe it. So that was sort of the thought process, and that's not something that we really would have thought about because we don't think about that, but that's something that's important apparently to a chunk of people here in Wheat Ridge. So the thing that we came to was there just isn't a practical mechanism for keeping me from building an ADU for my mother-in-law, and then when she dies, renting it out for income, right? Especially given what people are now paying for houses in Wheat Ridge, which is a lot more than they used to pay. So knowing that, we said you can't really, there's not a way to overcome that, right? So either you're going to sort of accept that reality and take lumps and say ADUs are now okay, and then sort of take your lumps from people who express the concerns that I just told you about, or you don't do it. So on top of that, just it wasn't a topic of interest for most people. It didn't really come up a whole lot, right? So it might be something that takes up council time or takes up staff time, but it wasn't something that people really were talking about in our process. We find it to be a niche housing product at best. Building a new ADU is hard. You've got to have certain lot demand, and understanding you don't have an ordinance, right? You don't have don't know if you ever considered a proposed ordinance or not, but a best practices ordinance around design is going to make it very difficult for most places in Wheat Ridge to build an ADU. They're difficult to finance. Actually, not that many people want them, so the number of inquiries of people who say, I want an ADU, will turn into actually only a very small number of ADUs on a percentage basis. So we recommended, I think the phrase we used at the retreat was the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Now, I will say that we didn't have an understanding that there's an historic ADU issue here in Wheat Ridge. That's something that was that comment that we heard tonight was somewhat new to me. That might be a slightly different issue, though related. But when it comes to the idea of allowing new ADUs when they're not currently allowed, we just don't think that it makes a whole lot of sense to spend time on that, political energy, so on and so forth. The other thing is that we also are we are inclined to be, so this is a personal bias, so I'm just telling you the personal bias, so it's on the table, is we're a bit allergic to planning flavor of the month things, and we're not convinced that ADUs are not a planning flavor of the month thing, quite honestly. Maybe they are a housing solution for the long term, maybe not. We know obviously that they've been around for a while, so it's not like ADUs are new, but this demand for ADUs, seeming demand for ADUs is somewhat new. We think also in coming to get to know Wheat Ridge a bit, that the argument of like, well, Denver's figured this out, why can't we? Or Lakewood has figured this out, why can't we? I've not found that to be a winning argument in Wheat Ridge. Most people in Wheat Ridge say, I don't care what Denver does, I don't care what Lakewood does, because I live in Wheat Ridge, and if I want to live in Lakewood, I'll move to Lakewood, right? That old thing of like, when your parents say, well, if your friend jumped off the bridge, would you jump off the bridge? That's kind of how we take that. So that's sort of our analysis on ADUs. That's what we heard from the community or didn't hear from the community. That's what we think the rub really is. That we think is somewhat insurmountable, unless somebody is much more legally clever than we are, and I'll admit that could be. But we know a bit about how law works as it relates to land use and zoning. And that's, I guess, where I'll leave it, unless there are more questions.
Mr. Keeter.
I don't know more than you do about this sort of thing. I may have raised this before. A couple people focused on, is there a possibility of dealing with this on a localized, more neighborhood basis? Is there any breakdown geographically of those, of the either survey numbers to determine whether there's more support or just even more interest in certain of the parts of town or neighborhood than others that could or would not justify perhaps looking at it on a localized basis?
It's a good question. Thomas, did you want to weigh in?
It's a great question. And the answer is no, that we didn't have a geographic breakdown with regard to where those survey responses came from. But what is interesting is that I think, based on the information that we've heard here tonight, kind of a little bit of a pause or some concern with regard to this 2-year listening tour, this engagement tour, this planning tour. I do think that I would think about that as an active listening tour. We don't think it's a sit back and do nothing for 2 years. And so the reason I'm saying that is because I think that you might find, as you go through that process, there are neighborhoods or portions of neighborhoods who find that ADUs may be acceptable, but we couldn't suss that out at the citywide level. And it kind of comes back to that quirkiness of this community and the variation in this community, whether you're in Applewood or East Wheat Ridge or Bel Air, there is a significant variation. And so it was leave it as a no for now, engage the community and find out if there are places where you could test this, ADUs or other planning mechanisms as well, hybridization of zoning, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that that kind of dovetails well to neighborhood engagement and listening moving forward. You do have differences, respect those differences. A one-size-fits-all, we certainly heard that is not going to work in Wheat Ridge. And so that was part of the recommendation for the neighborhood planning, the tour, if you will.
Ken, do you know if your resident survey was broken down that way?
It does, yeah. The resident survey, we can do cross tabs by council district.
And I guess just as a last thought on that, so ADUs is addressed separately in the report because it was an issue that was brought to you, not because you see it as a separate issue from the other planning aspects that are covered by the report.
Yeah, that's correct. We wanted to address it specifically.
Thank you.
Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On the issue of ADUs, I think it's a bit unfair to those property owners who have an existing quote-unquote illegal ADU for us to say we're going to do nothing for 2 years. And Councilmember Leah Dozeman and I had placed on the agenda more than a year ago now a discussion around a moratorium on enforcement regarding ADUs, because I think in some respects, even the slight possibility that the city might come down on a property owner for having an existing ADU keeps them from engaging in the process. Because why would you want to rat yourself out to say you have an ADU? So that, and just in and of itself, I think stifles the conversation around what are the costs, what are the benefits, what are the implications of a particular policy going one way or the other. But I think if we can't make up our minds, we need to let the residents make up their minds in the form of a ballot question, but something that gets us closer to dealing with what we already know exists, which are the city of Wheat Ridge has accessory dwelling units. But right now we're sort of pretending they're not there, but not really. And so as much as we might get direction from city staff saying they're not enforcing ADUs, that's not good enough for a property owner whose livelihood is on the line. So that's my main concern on this, is to not wait 2 years, but devise a mechanism so we have a way to engage everybody in the process without them having fear of government coming down on them.
Ms. Hoppe?
Thank you. And my opinion has not changed since the retreat, when I pushed back real hard on saying that we should not deal with ADUs. I do think that there needs to be, we need to do something. And if it is in the very least dealing with the already existing non-conforming ADUs, then I think that that's something that we should be looking at. Not necessarily just a moratorium on not enforcing anything, but trying to come up with some sort of substantial solution for the ones that are already out there.
Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I would agree, and I think that there have been some issues with how the ADU topic came to be on the final recommendation, and I think that it is because we have continually seen this issue come up on council. We've had residents reach out to us about this issue specifically, and when we originally started this process, we were talking about having a holistic conversation because we're recognizing that a lot of our founding documents need to be updated. So we're talking about our code enforcement, we're talking about our charter, we're talking about all sorts of things that we are going to be having to tackle, and we're seeing these issues where, some may see it as a distrust for city staff, but I see city staff adhering to the founding documents that we have adopted and we have been putting in place. And so they're looking at the code as it's written, the charter as it's written, the comprehensive plan, the sub-area plans, and they're basing their decisions off of those documents that we have created and that us as a council or the councils before us have adopted. And so for me, the ADU topic and Airbnb, because that really, I see those as two separate issues. So if we're talking about an accessory dwelling unit, we're talking about a land use issue, and we're talking about what is and isn't allowed per a certain and specific zoning. When we're talking Airbnb, we're talking about, lodging taxes and strangers coming in, and whether it's a single family unit versus a multifamily unit. And so zoning, of course, plays into that. But I think that if we are going to partake in a listening tour and be doing a lot of this local neighborhood level planning, that these conversations, we can't just take anything off of the table in my mind. We have to be addressing all of these things, and the quicker the better in my mind. But Yeah.
Thank you. We've had a pretty good, robust discussion. Are we ready to see if we can formulate a position to move forward? I guess what I'm, and I'm not quite sure how to receive the report. I assume that that's one way to look at it, is to receive the report at City Council. It does sound like there's a desire to engage in an ADU discussion. Mr. Matthews.
I was going to question that, but just the way you stated that led me to want to ask one more question. I know there are budget considerations for what you've signed up to do and what have you, but I would ask you folks, is there something that you think you've not been able to address that you think you should have been able to address? And do we need to hear what that is? I mean, do you consider this report as being pretty much 100% complete in what we were asking you to do to start with, or are there some omissions that you would like to address?
Thanks for the question, Larry. I think we sort of try to, not just to honor the process, but also as a matter of our own sort of professional philosophy, try to adhere to this idea that, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that perfection is not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And so we kind of approach it from a bit of a minimalist perspective. Another metaphor that our colleague Charles always uses is the Christmas tree. If these things are Christmas trees, you put too many ornaments on it, it's going to fall over, right? So I think that's all to say that we feel solid about this document. We feel that it reflects what we heard. We feel that the public sentiment, the mood, the perspective of the community, again, not 100%, but a strong majority is reflected in here and covers the most important stuff. If you said, was there anything else left to do? I mean, certainly, if we had 5 more years and a bigger budget, there's so many things some of the things that Leah was raising about all the things to do and do them fast, right? One of the things that we were sort of trying to get at, and it wasn't maybe stated in this way because it wasn't in response to this particular set of comments, but being able to, yes, there's a big sort of knot of things to deal with, right? But it can be difficult to do that comprehensively all at once. And certainly this process, as much as maybe we all would like for it to cover everything so you can get through all of it faster, the reality is that actually progress in our experience tends to be made not just faster, but better progress when some of these things can be disentangled and handled rationally in the pieces that they actually are. Sometimes that means handling 2 pieces at once. Sometimes it could be 1 piece at once. But that this is a way, just as an example, the neighborhood planning process is a way of taking these things apart and saying, all right, it's too big all at once. How do I get a smaller piece and solve this? And then I go on to the next piece, and then I go on to the next piece, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions here in Wheat Ridge, a lot of planning issues to deal with. I think as we're headed toward the end of this conversation here tonight, something we want to impress upon you is that a lot of communities with a lot of planning complexity and land use issues and legal issues, they don't get solved fast. They go really slow. I used to work in one in Boulder, and it drove me crazy sometimes. Like, what, it's gonna take 4 years to figure this out? And they would say, yes, this is the way it works, because trust the process is what they would say. And they were right, because that's what worked for them. And what they knew was, in a complex place with a tricky set of issues, with a very engaged population, speed and efficiency are not the things you're going for. Right? When you're trying to get to the right answer, sometimes it takes you longer. I mean, just as an example again, when I was there, 5 years I worked there. I think every year they kicked ADUs to the next year. Every year. I think they've subsequently done something on it, but that was their way. They kind of knew there's a ripe time for certain issues, sequencing, this thing's got to be figured out before that thing. So I think that I would just say that the inability to figure everything out today is not necessarily failure. I wouldn't consider it failure. I wouldn't consider this document failure because it doesn't do that, and I wouldn't consider your council conversations failure because you don't get there right away either. If anybody asked my opinion on that, which you didn't, but that's what I would say.
Eric, I had one more. We had one section of the report, connecting the community by investing in primary corridors. We didn't spend much time on primary corridors. Can you just give us a little overview of what you were considering in that regard?
I'd be happy to, Mayor. Thank you. Briefly. Okay, we're just near the end, so I'll run through this quickly. And again, public hasn't, but you certainly have. We covered this in quite a lot of detail and robust discussion at the April retreat. Primary corridors have long been an issue in Wheat Ridge. As I said, we didn't invent this as an issue. We didn't bring this here. The city has been working on 38th Avenue, so we're working on Wadsworth for quite a long time. Corridor conditions are an issue across the city. The primary corridors, Wadsworth, Kipling, 44th, Youngfield, 38th, these are the places, the corridors that carry the most traffic. They are largely commercial in nature, and they have the most psychological impact on the market that sees them, your internal market, all of you who live here, and the external market, people who visit, right? There's a lot of work to do, and it just isn't all going to get done in 10 years. Corridor work is certainly slow, as you probably know, and secondary corridors matter, so your 26th and 32nd and 29th in those places that are more residential in nature, less commercial, the traffic counts are lower. Those are corridors. They are important parts of your community, and they are important, but the nature of those needs is much less, and the priority, we think, has to be on the primary corridors for now. Again, this is just some survey data that tells us that 80% plus are interested in fixing this. Status, as we perceive it through our process, on 38th, the trend is generally positive. Community has, in our estimation, perceives it as positive. But as you all noted in April, you've got unfinished business on the streetscape. Wadsworth, definitely the worst ratings. Anybody who's driven it, looked at it, knows it needs help, and it's getting help. It's in the pipeline for a reconstruction, and just because that's not currently happening doesn't mean that that's not actually going to be a lot of work for the city. It will be. 44th, most of the issues on 44th are behind the curb, as opposed to, let's say, Wadsworth, where a lot of the problem is in the right-of-way. On 44th, it's right-of-way is not in too bad a condition. You've got continuous sidewalks, the pavement's okay. It's really the businesses and the properties that are along that stretch that need some work. And you are budgeted for a corridor plan for 44th. Kipling, there's high interest, a high sort of perceived level of need in fixing that, particularly between 44th and I-70, but so much of that is dependent on CDOT, and the future, their timing, funding, improvements there are uncertain. Doesn't seem to be in anybody's planning horizon right now. And we did ask about Youngfield, because you only have so many corridors, we have to ask about all of them. And if we ask people about Youngfield, they'll have opinions about Youngfield, but it didn't rate as the highest need. There's less interest in that, and we also think that, by the way, the west end of the city might look different in 10 years due to Clear Creek Crossing, and we would say, if you're going to do anything on Youngfield, kind of wait and see what happens. So we would deprioritize those last two and focus on these three. In brief, the recommendations for these three corridors are as follows. On 38th, the request from council is sort of we need a plan to move forward, and we think that another few years of monitoring incremental progress, things like West End 38, things like the Green Project, to see how those develop, and see sort of the look and feel of the improvements that they make and how that enhances the streetscape is important to sort of let that play out. As is living with another few years of the striping configuration, right? Just sort of let that sort of get into the fabric of the community more. And then, again, practically speaking, everything tonight is practically speaking, it's an expensive project to do the streetscape work that has been planned for. And the council, I think, endorsed some years ago. And so if that becomes a bonding issue in the future, after the current package of projects is done and paid down, that's probably 6, 7, 8 years in the future, I think. And so that gives you plenty of time to get your strategy together and figure out if that's something that the community wants to support as potentially a package of future projects. On Wadsworth, it's basically just get the public improvements done. So get that project out of its final planning phases, finalize the funding plan, which I think, if I understand everything correctly, that is on its way to happening. And so just make sure that that gets done and gets done to a high level of quality. And then in 44th, focus on behind the curb. A big part of the 44th plan will be to update a lot of the sort of the content that was in the Fruitdale area plan from about 10 years ago. You know, conditions have really changed. Let's just make sure that that's all current. And partially, you know, it's partially us and partially the conversation with you as well that dictated a focus for the 44th corridor plan going from Wadsworth west over to Youngfield and not doing the entire stretch. Why not the entire stretch? We think it's simply, it's just too much space, it's too much geography. So you could do it, but the downsides of doing that would be, it's going to be more expensive as a process if you're going to hire a consultant to do that. You've got more complexity, more things to look at, more properties, more curb cuts, so on and so forth. If you're going to do a public process, which we assume you will do because that's what you would do anyway and it's best practice, you're going to wear people out, it's going to involve the entire community, it's going to take longer. So just the scope we think would be too large. We do think, however, that 44th east of Wadsworth would be the next place you'd go for a corridor plan. And so we're not saying don't do it, we're just saying that this is where you need to focus your efforts first. If in 7 years from now, your staff is sitting around twiddling their thumbs saying, oh geez, we finished the NRS and now there's nothing left to do, which I'm sure is likely, right, Ken? Then I would say, great, you know, scope and go do an additional 44th corridor plan for that stretch. But that's the thinking, that's where the conversation we had back in April, and that's why we've recommended that. The issues that you're going to look at are the right-of-way assets and challenges. As I said, right-of-way is looking pretty good, but you've got some access issues, curb cuts, things that are going to impact that. The land use and regulatory framework, you're going to want to ask questions about what is the highest and best use for the land, the properties along 44th in that stretch. Is it, you know, what does the future maybe hold for us to the extent that we can make some predictions? What does the market tell us today? And then is the regulatory framework, the zoning in place, the right thing to accomplish any changes that might be desired by the community in those locations? To the extent that the vision the community has for that corridor doesn't match market reality, assuming the gap is between vision and reality is small enough, your economic development toolkit becomes really important there. And thinking about that. And then focusing on connections. So the west end of the city is, you've got a number of sort of what we call vital organs there. You've got future Clear Creek Crossing, you've got TOD, you've got Clear Creek Trail. So a lot of these pieces that are really important and this transportation network running through it. So you want to think about what are those connections looking like so that the west end of the city is going to function well for the community. And the reason we're going into this detail on 44th in terms of scoping the plan is Ken asked us early on to make sure we get some direction on actually what would go into that plan. What are the kind of questions we would ask? What's the content that we would cover? Neighborhood scale retail is something that we heard. This is sort of in the corridors section. This is something we heard a lot about, people having an interest not only in retail, restaurant, maybe that's closer to their house. And there are a few locations existing in the city already that you all know about, whether it's along 29th or potentially some future locations along maybe 26th. But there are some existing places, some opportunities for new. This would be a chance for people to have something closer to where they live, to feel like it's a neighborhood place, you know, something close to home. They could walk, they could bike. That's something that they feel is important. Those people who are, you know, commuting around the Denver metro area, they don't want to get back in the car on Tuesday night to drive somewhere for dinner. Maybe they want to walk, or they want to meet their friend for a drink. You know, same thing on Saturday morning. So that was important. And something else we heard a lot about in Wheat Ridge is local. Local, local, local. Everything that is new is a chain. Is there a possibility of more local establishments, locally owned, non-chain? And those smaller places, older spaces in many cases, might offer opportunities for that. There are challenges, of course. So, retail requires a certain either amount of car traffic or foot traffic or density of people around it. All of those things, if they're not enough, are barriers to small-scale retail development, right? And many of the locations that are suitable potentially in Wheat Ridge might suffer on those fronts. So it's something to note. I guess that's a bit tough to read, but this is just, again, some additional reinforcement from the community survey data, quotes that we pulled from the open-ended questions that people told us how important this was to them. So anyway, the tools are mostly in place. There may be some, in certain locations, if you want to make this happen, there may be some zoning tweaks necessary. There may be some zoning changes necessary to facilitate this if and when opportunities arise. We think you want to be careful about that, given the nature of the conversation we've had tonight about assuming too much and going in and making a zoning change because, well, NRS said that neighborhood retail is a good idea, so let's just make this change so neighborhood retail can happen. We wouldn't recommend just jumping to that conclusion necessarily. So, make sure that the engagement work is there along with it and that it's matching up with what the neighborhood is interested in. More or less, it's remaining patient and being opportunistic. The things we're saying here, we're glad they're memorialized in this document, but Ken and Steve and others know all this already, and so we're sort of just reinforcing it. They know how to do this. Last, I would say we want to call out and not neglect to say that because residential density matters to this, in locations where you think you might want to add additional sort of local walkable retail restaurant, it will help to the extent that you can increase the number of housing units within a close by area, okay? That doesn't mean everywhere you think retail should work, let's build this 5-story multifamily building. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is if where you think it's going to make sense over time may also already be in places where you're planned for and willing to accept, and zoning is in place for some additional density. So that these things go together is all we're saying. And then this is the last piece for tonight. This is not as major as the corridor work, not as major as the neighborhood engagement piece, and maybe not as controversial as the ADU piece, but it's something that we just wanted to note. Again, I think I said earlier that we're not critiquing any customer service that the city provides to people who are doing projects. We simply want to go on record as saying that this is something you want to definitely pay attention to over time, right? You've got old buildings here. I said that before. We've beaten that horse. Some people tell me we beat that horse too much, but it's true. Commercial structures, residential structures, and those old buildings need updates. They need the new lease on life. So as these properties now justify the investments because values are rising, I just want to make sure that the city is creating an environment where that is going to be as easy, I'll call it as easy as is responsibly possible, right? So probably everybody has a story about somebody who said, well, I have this old house. I didn't create the problems in the house. I went to get a building permit to do X, and they told me I had to fix Y, and now I'm mad, right? And if you have those stories in Wheat Ridge, which you might, I can tell you that every community in America has those stories. It's just the way it is. It's the nature of older building stock. This is one of my favorite things from Wheat Ridge. Does anybody know where this is? Yeah. Some people find this charming. Some people don't find this charming. But either way, it's an issue. So the recommendations that we've made are to, again, not a critique of existing way of doing business, but rather a doubling down on continuously being as good at it as possible. It's just to seek regular customer feedback and do it in a structured way. Build it into the fabric of the department, make sure it's routinized, all of that. Explore the possibility of some different approaches. Case management, for instance. I've worked in places where basically get the same inspector. If it's your permit, it's your inspector, they go together. That's not always feasible for a lot of reasons, but there are some benefits to doing it that way if it's possible. We also raised this idea of a rehab specialist or a liaison, somebody who's sort of dedicated to helping people through this morass, these things that can be very intimidating. Also to look at, consider the reality of the situation when you're updating codes. So I think the city has or is considering adopting at least pieces of the international existing building code, which would provide a bit of flexibility without, again, being irresponsible to sort of life and safety concerns. And again, we talked earlier about being flexible, right? We try not to be prescriptive because at the end of the day, we could be wrong. It's always possible we could be wrong. Nobody can sort of get rid of that possibility, but things can change and conditions can change and needs can change. And so we want to make sure that everybody's got the ability here to improvise and flex and adapt and look at this and say, just like sort of the original NRS, right? As detailed as that was, it didn't tell you every single thing to do. It didn't give you, it wasn't an instruction manual, 300 pages in type 8, size 8 typeface. Nor is this. This is the direction we think you ought to go. These are the ideas and concepts that are important as we see them and as we think the community told us they are. And, take that and run with it and be experimental. And
thank you.
Improvise.
Thank you.
That's it.
Mr. Pond, you had something?
I did.
Wherever you want to go.
That's where I want to go. I want to thank everyone. I know Janice thanked everyone. Obviously, a tremendous amount of work across the board. Thank you to the consultants who have stayed with us, and I think the times I hear you guys talking about the process, it's clear that you've been engaged and that it was an active process. So thank you for that. I like the plan. I like how it reads. I like how it looks. I liked the conversation tonight. I think there's definitely some things that we brought up at the retreat that are being brought up again here. And I feel comfortable with us continuing to talk about those things. I agree with the prioritization of the corridors as listed in the plan. Happen to agree with the the emphasis on the rehab and the customer service aspects of it as well. So I'm really behind that, and I think as it was presented in the packet, ready to bring it forward to a council meeting and for us to adopt it as it were. If I have any questions, it's making sure that staff or anyone feels like there's things to do moving forward once we adopt this. I think there is. I can see people to hire and plans to develop that and steps to take. And so to me, it seems like it's actionable. But if there's any concern about that, I would want to make sure we're dealing with it either tonight or when it comes up at council.
Would it be one way to approach this? We have a summary of recommendations in section 5. One of them is building capacity to manage neighborhood change, and others connecting the community by investing in primary corridors. Thirdly, facilitate investment through customer service, and the fourth one was accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Would it be possible to sort of adopt those themes, if you will, or those major headings in the report, and then we could continue to discuss the implementation strategies that are contained in the report on a more particular basis at future, to guide us along future discussions? Ms. Hoppe?
I just wonder why we wouldn't just adopt the entire report.
Well, the entire report tells us to wait 2 years, or there were other sort of features of the report.
And it's also stated that these are recommendations, not hard deadline, like hard actions, and so I would wonder why we wouldn't do the entire report.
We could adopt it by resolution and as a guiding document. It's not a binding document that we could put some language in there that implementation steps would be further discussed and vetted. But the overall themes are a consensus to move forward on staff time. And with that, Kim, do you think that works? We get it. There's a lot of detail in there, and Zach made some comments and others that maybe that's not exactly the way we want to move forward with it, but we can always bring those back before we get into the weeds on how to move forward on each of those four major items.
Ms. Dozeman?
So just for the sake of transparency, could you guys maybe speak to how 38th Avenue became our #1 priority for corridors?
Well, first I would, maybe the caveat is they are numbered 1, 2, 3, but it doesn't necessarily mean that 1 is more important than 3, for instance. But yes, those 3 are certainly the top 3. The way we see it, again, being from outside, and we come to Wheat Ridge and we go to Right Coast Pizza and we go up and down 38th Avenue, and there's an argument to be made that you could just sort of let it sit as is. And if it's better than it was, that's great, but to us doesn't look like there's a big problem there. That's again our sort of personal bias. But the conversation that we've had, and it's not just the conversation we had with you all at the retreat, though that was certainly a big part of it. There is sort of a sense of this unfinished business of we've got this thing, we said we wanted to do it, and we haven't done it yet, and let's do it. We think that sort of the approach of take the time between now and whenever your next big sort of bond financial planning conversations start to happen, or through that process, I should say, that's the time we really start to bake that in and give yourself the opportunity to get that done in an amount of time that probably falls within the implementation timeline of this thing. And that seems reasonable to us, for sure. Seems responsible to us, and seems in keeping with the way you've done some public improvements here in the recent past. Does that make sense? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I don't know if I really feel that it was a major concern amongst the citizens that participated, or if it's more of a concern of us as council and prior policy.
Yes, so complete full transparency, what we think we heard was nobody wanted to argue about past controversies. The sentiment about the way that 38th has developed in the past 5 or 10 years was generally positive. And our sense was that people would like to see more of the way that 38th has developed in the last few years. And particularly given the emphasis on walkable restaurant, walkable retail, local, those things are connected as well.
So I also wanted to make a quick comment that I really appreciated seeing the inspection and having like one inspector that is on a project from start to finish to help with continuity, because I think that is a major issue that I've been hearing amongst businesses. And I know that our permitting process and a lot of things need some work. So I've talked to a couple of the NRS members and how we can talk to the staff further about permitting process and how to maybe mitigate the red tape or streamline that process and make it easier and hopefully more accessible so that people will pull permits when they're doing work.
Thank you. Mr. Urban.
I guess a little bit to that point, when we're talking about customer service, I think it's a little bit more difficult in a city setting to define customer service, because in some regards, if we're asking a property owner to install a sprinkler system, that's something that they may not necessarily enjoy having to hear, but we as the city are providing customer service to our citizens by telling that property owner they have to adhere to that code or this or that. So in some regards, the customer service of the city is to adhere to the laws that are written, and so that does somewhat concern me that we're trying to necessarily just make it easy for easy's sake, when in reality it's the codes that we're using that dictate that says that we want to have a safe, decent place to live. So it is somewhat concerning on that end. But the other side of this, just from a customer service perspective, how does the rubber meet the road within the city of Wheat Ridge when we've already farmed out our building department as it is? So how do we reach through that contractor to then facilitate changes in this process when in some respects it feels like we're somewhat segregated from it because we've farmed that out? So
it's only farmed out in the sense is that it's under a contract. All of the employees that work for Charles Abbott work on site at City Hall. They all have City of Wheat Ridge emails. They drive their vehicles that say the City of Wheat Ridge on it. So they're integrated into our system. The only really difference is that they're being paid by a different company. But they work for us, with us on a daily basis. The CBO, our chief building official, is at City Hall every day, works with Ken daily. So we feel it's working much better. You talk about consistency with having staffing. We, for many years, could not staff that department. And going through a contract has enabled us to have full-time staff on. Ever since we've been under contract, we've had full staff of inspectors. Yeah, occasionally you're not always going to have the exact same inspector on every project. That's just never, ever going to happen. And can't guarantee that unless you want us to have 50 inspectors. But I think we do our best to make sure that we have the same inspectors as possible, but that just can't happen all the time. So we feel, Zach, that even though it's farmed out, it's very integrated into our city system.
Well, but to that point, though, as we're talking about customer service, what I hear from folks anecdotally is that they don't want to complain because then if they do complain, that puts some sort of mysterious black marks on their property, which I know is not the case, but it's their perception of reality, and that if they were to complain, things are just going to get worse for them as opposed to better. So in this process of customer service, if there's an ombudsman or some other way to structure it so someone could make a legitimate complaint without it necessarily blowing back on them or them perceiving that there's sort of a whistleblower effect. And I just want to make sure that we're getting good quality feedback from developers, from contractors, from property owners to truly understand, are they just irritated by the fact they have to follow a code, or do they have a legitimate gripe about our process versus what they're doing in Lakewood?
We understand that, and we hear that occasionally, that they think there's retribution, and I can tell you 100% there's not. And if we can do a better job of through our customer service of creating a system, just like you maybe mentioned, I think that's part of this recommendation, and I think that's what we can look at. But we do reach out to contractors. We get a lot of feedback, good and bad, and we try to address it. But there's always that sense, unfortunately, because unfortunately there's a lot of bad information that gets spread around on social media in this community about how bad our building department is, and it's just not true. So it's part of that too, stopping that.
I also, if I could just really quick, I think that the city is lucky to have the staff that it has here. You know, we have been staff, we work for a lot of staff. I don't think that we can argue that you know, what Ken, Patrick, and others here on staff have done in the last decade plus to sort of modernize Wheat Ridge city government and get it to the place where it is. So we think of it as Wheat Ridge 1.0 to Wheat Ridge 2.0. The number of accomplishments there are too long to list. And we personally, in working with them, have no doubt that whatever 3.0 might become is something that they could deliver. So we just wanted to not let that go unsaid. And part of the reason that we feel comfortable leaving this in the hands of your staff is we know that they will figure it out and help you figure it out as well.
Well, with that, do we have consensus to receive the report for adoption and the recommendations that we can consider and to do more thought to in particular? Is there consensus there?
Consensus to bring forward a resolution of approval?
Okay, we have consensus on that. I'd like to thank Eric and Thomas.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
Before you thank them, I mean, I want you to give them a nice thank you, but I wanted to ask a question about the consensus. Is it all right with everybody if I write in the minutes, there was consensus to accept the report and use the information to guide further discussion and decision-making? Does that cover everybody's?
Well, it'll come back, Janelle, at a regular business meeting for adoption by a resolution. I think that's what the consensus is.
And that resolution will mirror some of that
Yes.
consensus language.
Okay.
Is that covered?
All right.
Okay. So let me backtrack just a little bit and thank Thomas and Eric for their presentation on the report and their work with our committee over the year. And I really want to echo the other members of the council, and I'm sure I speak for everyone, in our sincere thank you to all of the citizens who helped lead this report, who were instrumental in and came to the meetings. There were a lot of meetings on this thing, who gave input into the process, and hopefully we had a thorough sort of vetting of a lot of these issues and a good discussion in our community, because I think it gives us a way to talk to one another and to talk about issues that sometimes are not easy to discuss. And I think we've come up with a lot of creative ideas and a really positive effort going forward. So I want to express my thank you. We are going to adjourn for about 10 minutes before we undertake item number 2. So thank you very much. Okay.
I don't know if our city clerk is ready to.
Oh.
So I was periodically checking on school, and the mother went in, and then she never came back. Feeding them from the road. Hoping they would get big enough to go away. They're never going to make me eat that. Well, they tied up the chimney.
You lost it. You lost some of your crowd.
Yeah. We're gonna lose the mayor if we don't hurry.
Okay, you want me to start?
Are you ready to roll? Okay.
You're on.
Thank you very much. We will reconvene our meeting, our study session. I want to turn to agenda item number 2. This is the Ridgetop Village Metropolitan District Service Plan. And we have a guest with us, Mr. Goff. Would you please introduce our guest on this
We do.
presentation?
Russ Dykstra is here with the firm of Spencer Fain, who's representing the developer for the service plan. And I do need to apologize in your memo, if any of you caught this. Under the background section, it was a carryover from the Yarrow Gardens Metropolitan District Plan. I forgot to change that section of it, so it mentioned the law firm of White Bear. It's actually Spencer Fain who's working on this metropolitan district, and Russ, who is here this evening to give you a brief presentation.
Mr. Dykstra.
All right, thank you very much. I thought I had joined a new law firm unknowingly, but that's okay. I'm going to go quickly from the 30,000-foot level you've been working at most of the evening down to the micro level of a project and how to implement it on a neighborhood basis. The location you are very familiar with is 4,000 Upham. I got to do this here. And that is off the 38th corridor near the Wadsworth Shopping Center. And we've talked about the nearby redevelopment on that. And if you want me to slow down, let me know, but I know it's been a long night, so. The district's main purpose is to provide the public improvements and to be an ongoing neighborhood organization. Typically for developments like this, you've got an HOA or a district, one of the two. In this case, because there are public improvements that need to be paid for and operated and maintained going forward into the future, we felt that a district was the optimal tool for that. Rather than having both, which you see in some places more and more as we're doing more infill projects that are small, distinct. We choose one or the other just to make it more economical for the residents and overall for management. It doesn't make sense to have an HOA manager or a district manager, everything else involved. The primary purposes are listed there are going to be the sanitation, the storm, the water, streets, traffic, safety controls, park and rec, which in this case is the small pocket park in the center. We'll go there that you're familiar with right in the middle. And the districts, after this is all formed and built, the district will be the operating agency. So the snow plowing, the road maintenance, the park mowing, all of those things, and on top of it, uniquely covenant enforcement. So there'll be just typical covenants like any development, but instead of having an HOA board enforce them under Title 32, there's a mechanism where the district will be the enforcement agency. It's not some other board, it's all residents, they're elected just like any other entity. Especially, we're seeing more and more of these small developments doing this. They're built out in 2 to 3 years. So in 4-year election cycle, the board will be primarily residents at that point. So it's a pretty quick turnover compared to a lot of the large master plan type developments. And this is one of the main aspects of the district as far as infrastructure is going to be the expansion of this detention pond. The Jeffco Schools is really interested and excited about having another governmental entity being a party to the agreement to operate and maintain that detention pond. Gives them a little more certainty. There's certainty of revenue streams with a district It's a lot easier for districts to maintain their cash flow on a yearly basis because they're certified through the treasurer, and there's a lot more, again, certainty with that. There's governmental immunity with it, which also includes lower insurance costs and savings to the residents for that. The on-site improvements, there's a list there. There's really no huge improvements because the site's so small, but there's just a lot of little ones in the $200,000 to $50,000 range that just cumulatively build up on something like this. I don't know, we can go through the detail if you have questions on that. Fairly typical for something of this nature. And the off-sites would be Upham Street improvements, the storm drainage basin, which is the big one we just talked about, and erosion control, as long as with the normal soft costs associated with that. All right, so the key, let me get it up here. The key characteristics for this one we've kind of gone through, or I've described. It's going to provide the initial contributions, going to, in essence, replace an HOA, and it's going to provide ongoing operation of all of those improvements. And the impacts are going to be, the mill levy is going to be very consistent with Ward TOD and with the Yarrow Gardens one. It's going to be the same caps and limits on that. We're going to have a maximum debt issuance of $2 million, which we think will be more than enough to handle what's contemplated for this project. And we also wanted to give a flavor of what this means for the projected house value of $500,000. It'll be approximately $3,000 in taxes, which equates to $257 a month, which in our experience is pretty consistent with a development of this type, what you'd pay to an HOA to maintain and operate these types of improvements. And that's the schedule. And for what one? For the water, there'll be individual meter taps. So what will happen is okay. So the water and sewer main lines that are going into the project, those will be built and then turned over to the water and sewer provider districts. So they'll do, and then each unit will have their own water meter and sewer tap. So they'll have to pay for those bills individually. Did that answer your question? Okay. And I am happy to answer any questions, and I would say that per the last conversation, we do these all over the state, and your staff is excellent. Patrick and Ken have been very helpful, very responsive, and we really appreciate their help. So I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Thank you. Do we have questions from Mr. Dykstra? Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With respect to the elections for the district board, the criteria to be an eligible elector in that, is that both owning property and or being a resident, or what's the criteria for an elector?
Very good question. There are several different provisions under Title 32 that qualify you as an elector. You can be a resident, you can be a property owner, or you can be under contract to purchase property and the contract obligates you to pay taxes. That last provision was put in specifically for these types of situations where you've got either vacant land or redeveloping land where there's nobody that fits those first two criteria, in order to get the initial board established. So, and those are put on and approved by the court, and they say this election can take place to elect these board members as the qualified directors going forward. After that, they're on a staggered schedule every 2 years. So depending on how it's set up, initially we usually have 3 board members go for the first 4 years and 2 for 2 years. So as residents come in, they can start running for those positions, and with small developments like this, that happens pretty quickly.
So then in an election or an issue there, both the potential landlord and the tenant in one of these units would both have voting rights, or just one of them?
Well, in this case, they're going to be for sale units. So
Right, but the more than, or less than 49% could be rental. Someone can purchase this and then rent it out, so long as it isn't more than 49% of the...
Potentially under that scenario, yes, you could. Yep.
Okay.
But I do need to expand the definition of eligible electors. They also have to be a natural person, so it can't be a corporate entity, and they have to be registered to vote.
Okay.
Mr. Matthews.
Are those paid positions or are they volunteer?
The board can decide by statute. You can get a $100 stipend per meeting for each board member, but that is strictly the decision of the board as to whether they want to have that in place or not.
And I noticed where you're starting this out, you're calling this an undeveloped properties with no existing population. They are serviced, and that they're not serviced by any district, but they are actually serviced now, and there's people living there, and they're not undeveloped. So why do we start with that preamble in several places here, that it's like it's a vacant lot that nobody's ever owned?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and it comes up a lot in these redevelopment scenarios. When we're putting a service plan together in the financial plan, we base it off zero. Just start from zero, because if the development occurs the way it's projected, there'll be a ground zero where there's nothing there. And we'd rather base it off of that, just so we have realistic projections going forward rather than trying to account for existing conditions that are short-term.
Are these going to become city streets, or are they going to remain like driveways?
The internal streets to the development will be owned and operated by the district itself. So the district will be responsible for all the maintenance, the snow plowing, everything else.
Additional questions?
We have this scheduled for June 24th, I believe we moved it to, for the actual public hearing and resolution for consideration of approval of that EV.
Mr. Matthews?
I'm sorry. At some point in time, and I missed that in here, you just say you may turn it over to the, I saw language in here that said you may turn it over, like the water, the sewer lines. You may turn it over to the supplier, I mean, instead of shall. So there's no specific determinate time when you're going to do that?
That's largely determined by the service provider. Obviously, we don't want to state in here that the water district shall take it over, because we obviously don't control their processes and their approvals as a governmental entity, so we can't, well, we could, but it's in our experience wise not to presume that and rather ask them for permission. I've never had a situation where that hasn't occurred, as long as we meet their standards and their requirements, which we have to meet anyway.
And then is there specific language in here, for instance, when we incorporated, we had certain things that were different, like with the first council, or, that they gave themselves like a year or something in order to get on a regular cycle. Eventually, will the people on the board, the Metropolitan District Board, have to be residents or owners in this district?
Yes, that's statutory. So that will happen, and as a natural course, as the development wraps up and the developers are gone, the only people left who are eligible will be the residents.
And I'm a little curious.
Or property owners.
I'm a little curious, and not specific to you, but in general, what happens if they decide they want to dissolve this Metropolitan Board down the road somewhere?
That's a very good question. The statute provides that as long as all of the obligations that are the districts are taken care of, so for instance, we'll use in this case the detention pond. So if the Jeffco schools would agree, okay, we'll take back responsibility for maintaining that pond going forward, okay, then then we could dissolve. And if someone else or some other entity took over the operation, the maintenance, the snow plowing, the covenant enforcement, then the district could dissolve. That can only happen by a vote of all of the eligible electors in the district.
Thank you.
By majority vote?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Any further questions? Do I have consensus to move this forward? Okay, it looks like we have consensus to move this forward on whatever date we have it scheduled in the calendar, June 24th. Okay, thank you, Mr. Dykstra.
Thank you.
That concludes the agenda items that we have on the calendar tonight. Staff reports, Mr. Goff.
Nothing else this evening.
Okay, thank you. We will go to item number 4, elected officials matters. Mr. Keeter.
Just for everybody on the line to remind them about the Criterium and Brewfest on Sunday at the Green.
Very good. Anyone else in our council? Ms. Dozman.
Yeah, Miss Davis, I'm taking her seat. Wow. So something I learned this evening is that Wheat Ridge does not allow wildlife rehabilitation centers within our city limits, or that has been what I've been told in my adventures of raccoons on my property today. So I don't know if that's maybe something that we can address, because unfortunately animal control is not available after 5 p.m. Most days, and not on weekends. And even if they were to respond to a wildlife issue, usually the animals are humanely euthanized. And so that was a little bit of a stressful evening, having to try to navigate a wildlife rehabilitation organization to come and rescue these baby raccoons. So I know it's a personal issue, but I just kind of wanted to maybe look at that and get some information from staff about why it is that we don't allow those, or if we do or don't, and all that. So thank you.
Additional, Mr. Urban.
In the wake of the Virginia Beach shooting that involved many municipal employees, I just wanted to take a chance to say thank you to all of our city employees who show up to work today and who do every day to make our city great, and just want to make sure that we recognize the impact those tragic situations have on our own employees as they go about their business, and just want to make sure they know that they're appreciated, and we are thankful for every day that they show up and do a great job for us.
Thank you. And I would say that I've talked with our city manager, and we do have plans in the work for security enhancements to our facility, and operations and training opportunities for our staff to undergo, so that we, become more defensive and have a safer posture. And no one else. I have one thing. This Saturday will be second Saturday, and I will hold a coffee at Vinola's restaurant at 38th Avenue and is it Yarrow Street? And I hope at 9 o'clock in the morning. So if you want to come down for a cup of coffee and some cookies and some good conversation, I'll be down there. So there being no more further business, we will adjourn. Thank you so much.